There's a particular category of thing you never actually chose to learn. You just absorbed it. And for a lot of us, SpongeBob is sitting right at the top of that list. I couldn't tell you when I last watched an episode properly, and I could still sing the entire theme song from memory with a gun to my head, which is a strange thing to be able to say about a cartoon. What I've got for you is not a rewatch and not a ranking. It's everything sitting underneath the thing, and there turns out to be an enormous amount of it. A marine biology teacher who drew a comic nobody would publish, a pitch involving a fish tank, and two men in Hawaiian shirts. A town sat under a real nuclear test site, which the show has since owned up to. An octopus with the wrong name and the wrong number of limbs. Nothing in here is dramatic, which is rather the point. It's a large pile of small, well-documented, faintly odd facts, and I've spent a while sorting through them. If you enjoy this sort of thing, there's a subscribe button somewhere. Let's get into it. Before any of this existed, there was a bloke in California teaching children about tide pools. Stephen Hillenburg was born in Lawton, Oklahoma in 1961, and he came up through the American West with two interests running in parallel that most people would tell you have nothing to do with each other. He liked drawing and he liked the sea, not in a vague poster-on-the-wall way. He went and got a degree in marine biology from Humboldt State University up in Arcata, which is about as far north as you can go in California before you fall into Oregon. He graduated in 1984, and his major was in marine resource planning and interpretation, which is a mouthful, and which means roughly the science, plus how you explain the science to people who don't have it. That second half turns out to matter enormously. Straight out of university, he took a job at the Orange County Marine Institute in Dana Point, which these days goes by the Ocean Institute. He taught there for about 3 years from 1984 to 1987. And the job wasn't lab work, it was hands-on education. School groups arriving on buses, children being walked out to the rocks and shown what actually lives in the gaps between the tides. Sea anemones, sponges, starfish, crabs sulking under overhangs. That whole strip of coastline that's underwater half the day and exposed the other half, which is genuinely one of the more brutal places anything can choose to live. And here's the problem with teaching that particular subject to 9-year-olds. A tide pool doesn't do very much while you're standing over it. The animals are slow, most of them are the colour of the rock, and a fair number of them look like they might be a plant. So Hillenburg did what a certain kind of teacher does, which is make his own materials. He drew a comic. It was called The Intertidal Zone, and it explained the ecosystem through anthropomorphic sea creatures. Talking crabs, talking anemones, that sort of thing, but with actual accurate biology loaded into the jokes. The idea being that if a child laughs at a hermit crab having an argument, the child also, quietly, learns what a hermit crab is. The comic was hosted by a character called Bob the Sponge. Now, Bob the Sponge did not look like SpongeBob. This is the detail I always find myself coming back to. He looked like an actual sponge, which is to say, a lumpy, porous, brownish, faintly unpleasant-looking blob, because that's what real sea sponges look like. Porifera. No brain, no nervous system, no organs, no mouth. Water goes in through the pores, food gets filtered out, water goes out again. That's the entire animal. Bob had sunglasses stuck on the front of him, and that was about as far as the character design went. I love that. The most recognisable cartoon character of the modern era started life as a scientifically accurate lump with shades. Hillenburg tried to get the comic published properly, went out looking for someone to print it. Nobody was interested. Which, if you think about the pitch, is not exactly shocking. An educational tide pool comic by an unknown marine science teacher is not a book anyone was fighting over in the late 80s. So it stayed a teaching aid. Photocopied, handed out, used, and that was meant to be the end of it. Then in 1987 he did something a lot of people talk about doing and almost nobody actually does. He quit the science career and went to art school, specifically the experimental animation program at the California Institute of the Arts, which is a serious place with serious people in it. His teacher there was Jules Engel, a genuinely significant figure in animation, and by most accounts Engel let him into the programme, partly on the strength of that unpublished Tide Pool comic. Think about that for a second. The thing nobody would print is the thing that got him in the door. At Cal Arts he made student films. 2 of them mattered, The Green Beret and Wormholes, both from 1992. Wormholes in particular did the rounds at festivals, and they were odd, arty, hand-drawn things, nothing like what he'd end up famous for. But they got noticed, and getting noticed is most of the job. What came out of that was a role on Rocko's Modern Life, the Nickelodeon series that ran from 1993 to 1996. Hillenburg came in as a storyboard artist and eventually directed, and Rocko is a properly important piece of this story because it's not just where he learned the mechanics of running an animated show, it's where he met the people he'd take with him. The SpongeBob crew is, to a slightly absurd degree, the Rocko crew. Writers, artists, the music editor, and a voice actor called Tom Kenny, who we'll get to at length later on, because he deserves it. Rocko was cancelled in 1996, and rather than go looking for the next job, Hillenburg went back to the comic. He'd been carrying these characters around for the better part of a decade at this point. A sponge, a crab, a starfish, an octopus, creatures he'd drawn to explain an ecosystem, now being reworked into a cast. He set up a production company called United Plankton Pictures in 1998, which remains one of the better company names in television, and started building the thing properly. There's a version of this story that gets told as a lucky break, and I don't think that's right. It took roughly 10 years, teaching, then art school, then somebody else's cartoon, then his own. That's a long walk, and the whole time the raw material was a stack of photocopies about tide pools. One more thing on the comic before we move on, because it has a nice ending. The Intertidal Zone stayed unpublished for decades. Then in 2011, when SpongeBob Comics launched as an ongoing series, they reprinted material from it in the first issue, so the thing that got turned down eventually got printed anyway, purely on the strength of what it turned into, 20-odd years late. The Internet Archive has since made a scan of it available, and people do go and look at it, mostly out of curiosity about Bob. He's still lumpy, he's still wearing the sunglasses. There is a straight line from that to a yellow rectangle in brown trousers, and the line is about as long and as strange as lines get. What I keep thinking about with Hillenburg is that he never really stopped being the person from the first part of the story. He's not a man who did marine biology and then did cartoons. The cartoon is a marine biology thing. You'll see this everywhere once we start pulling the show apart. The reason Squidward has a big head, the reason Pearl looks the way she does, the reason a very silly line about holographic meatloaf is actually a joke about photosynthesis. It's all the same person, still explaining tide pools, just with a much better budget and considerably more eyeballs. But the thing that actually got it onto television wasn't the biology or the drawings. It was a fish tank and a pair of Hawaiian shirts. So let's talk about that. Actually, before we leave him behind entirely, there are a few more things about Hillenburg worth having, because they explain the show better than any amount of analysis does. He worked as a fry cook. In high school, and for a few years after, he cooked in a seafood restaurant and boiled lobsters. That's a documented part of his history, and it is, I'd argue, at least as important as the marine biology degree. The single most repeated image in the entire series is a person standing over a grill in a paper hat, deeply and sincerely proud of a hamburger. That's not an invented setting. He'd done that job. The other thing that shaped him was Jacques Cousteau. Hillenburg has said the Cousteau documentaries were formative for him as a child, and once you know that, the French narrator makes complete sense. It isn't a random accent gag. It's a direct tribute to the specific voice that made a kid in Oklahoma care about the ocean in the first place. Every time that narrator says, "Ah, the sea," you're hearing a man thanking the person who started it. There's a nice detail in the geography of his early life too. Lawton, Oklahoma, is about as far from an ocean as it is possible to get in the continental United States. His father worked in aerospace, and the family moved to California when he was small, and that's where the coast entered the picture. So the person who built the most famous underwater world in television started out landlocked. He surfed, he drew constantly as a child, he collected things off beaches. All of the standard components were there early, they just took a while to arrange themselves into a career. The other bit of his history that people skip is that he didn't leap straight from teaching to animating. He did the degree at CalArts, which is a proper 2-year commitment and not a weekend course. And while he was there, he made films that had nothing to do with cartoons about sponges. Wormholes, from 1992, is a short about relativity, actual physics. It went round festivals and won things, and it's about as far from Bikini Bottom as you could imagine. I find that genuinely reassuring as a fact. The man who made the silliest show on television was at that point making an experimental short about the nature of time. And there's a detail about Rocco's modern life that I want to give proper weight to, because he worked on another cartoon first, undersells it enormously. Rocco is a strange show. It ran from 1993 to 1996 on Nickelodeon. It's about a wallaby living in a suburb, and it is packed with jokes that are not for children. It's cynical in a way SpongeBob almost never is. And the crew on it was a specific, unusual group of people who all liked the same odd things, and that group essentially transferred wholesale. The music editor came from Rocco, the writers came from Rocco, the lead voice actor came from Rocco, the visual instincts came from Rocco. Even the approach to library music, which we'll come to later, is a Rocco habit. So when Rocco was cancelled in 1996, what actually happened was that a fully formed creative team was suddenly available at the same moment that one of them had a decade-old idea in a drawer. That's the real story of how the show got made. Not a lucky pitch, a cancellation with excellent timing. Hillenburg set up United Plankton Pictures in 1998 to house it, and assembled the team mostly out of people he'd already worked with, which is why the first 3 seasons feel so consistent. It isn't a group of freelancers finding a tone, it's a group of friends who already had one. One last thing about the comic, and then I'll genuinely move on. The intertidal zone was never a slick object. It's a black and white photocopied thing, hand-lettered, with the sort of art you'd expect from a talented person who is not yet a professional illustrator. The characters explain the intertidal zone directly to the reader. There are diagrams. There are labels. It is unmistakably a teaching document. And the thing that survives from it into the show isn't the art style at all. It's the posture. The comic assumes that its audience is interested and treats them accordingly, and it never talks down. Which is, if you think about it, the defining quality of SpongeBob as well. It's a show for small children that never once assumes the small children are stupid. That's a rarer quality than it should be, and I think it comes straight from 3 years of standing in front of school groups and finding out very quickly what bores them. Pitch meetings are, by all accounts, fairly grim affairs. You go into a room, you show some drawings, executives look at them, and then you go home and wait. Most people bring a folder. Hillenburg brought an aquarium. This was 1997. He'd spent weeks building a miniature version of the town inside a large tank. Little sets, little squeezy toy versions of the characters. The whole thing covered with a sheet, so nobody could see it, and then wheeled into the meeting room like a piece of evidence. He and Derek Dryman, who was the creative director on the project, both put on garish Hawaiian shirts. And they walked into the room with a boombox playing Hawaiian music, including a Tiny Tim song that shows up in the third act of the pilot itself. I would very much like to have been in that room. Not to see the pitch, just to watch the faces of whoever was already sitting there when the door opened. Eric Coleman, who was running animation development at Nickelodeon, described the setup afterwards as pretty amazing and said Hillenburg went above and beyond, which in executive language is close to shouting. But the detail that always gets me is what happened at the end. Kevin Kay and Albie Hecht, two of the Nickelodeon people in the room, got up and left. They went outside because they were exhausted from laughing and needed to stop. And the crew took this badly. Obviously, if you've just performed your life's work at 4 strangers and 2 of them walk out, your first thought is not, that went well. Dryman has said the pitch was stressful and that they assumed the executives would fly back to New York and they'd hear something in a few weeks. Instead, the executives came back into the room after what felt like minutes and said they wanted to make it, which is about as good as that day can possibly go. Now, the name. The character was not called SpongeBob. He was called SpongeBoy. And the show was going to be called SpongeBoy Ahoy, which I have to say I quite like as a title, in a corny sort of way. He had no surname at all, just SpongeBoy, in the way that a lot of cartoon characters just have the one name and nobody asks questions. They got the whole 7-minute pilot voiced, recorded, done. And then Nickelodeon's legal department came back and said the name was already in use for a mop. There was a cleaning product called SpongeBoy. And on top of that, a character with the same name had already been trademarked by Bob Burden, the man behind Flaming Carrot Comics. So that was that. The name was gone after the voice work. Hillenburg's constraint when picking a replacement was, I think, very funny and also completely reasonable. He decided the name still had to contain the word sponge. His stated reason was that otherwise viewers might not know what they were looking at, and specifically that they might think the character was a cheese man. I've looked at the early designs. He wasn't wrong. Take the word sponge out of the name, and you're looking at a yellow rectangle full of holes, and cheese is genuinely the first place your brain goes. So, SpongeBob. And then the surname arrived from an unexpected direction. Tom Kenny, who by this point had been cast, was looking at a picture of the character and said something along the lines of, "Look at this sponge in SquarePants, thinking he can get a job in a fast food place." Hillenburg loved it, partly for the sound of it, and partly because he felt it made the character read as a bit of a nerd, which was exactly right. SquarePants, from an offhand comment about the drawing, made by the man who'd end up voicing him ever since. There's one more fight from this period, and it's arguably the most consequential creative decision in the entire show. Nickelodeon wanted SpongeBob to be a child, a kid at school. This is a completely standard network instinct, because their audience is children, and children like watching children. Hillenburg wanted him to be an adult. He had a job, he had a mortgage-adjacent living situation, he had a boss. That was the joke. And Hillenburg was apparently prepared to walk away over it, which, given how long he'd been carrying this thing, is a fairly bold position to take in your first meeting. The compromise they landed on is genuinely elegant, and it's why one of the main characters exists. He invented Mrs. Puff and her boating school. SpongeBob stays an adult with a job and a house. And he also goes to school, because he's a grown man who cannot pass his driving test. Everything about that is better than the network's version. It gives you a permanent, renewable source of failure for a character who otherwise succeeds at everything he tries. It gives you a teacher with visible trauma. It gives you the running joke that this man has been at driving school for the entire run of the show and has never once got the license, and none of it exists if he'd just said, "Fine, make him 10. The pilot that came out of all this was Help Wanted, and Nickelodeon handled the launch in a way that tells you they knew what they had. They didn't just slot it into a Saturday morning and hope. They aired a preview on the 1st of May, 1999, directly after the Kids' Choice Awards, which is to say in front of every child in America who was already sitting in front of that channel. Then the series officially premiered on the 17th of July. It did not explode immediately. That's worth saying, because the story usually gets compressed into instant phenomenon. It built through the first season and properly took off in the second. But it took off in the way that makes network executives go slightly pale, and it's still going. A couple of smaller things from this era that I enjoy. The first is that the crew genuinely believed the pilot lived or died on whether the executives laughed, not whether they nodded or asked sensible questions about demographics, whether they laughed. That's a much more honest metric than anything a focus group produces, and it's also why the aquarium and the shirts and the boombox made sense. They weren't showing a concept, they were doing a performance. The second is that Albie Hecht, the Nickelodeon official, later said the pitch was a performance he wished he had on tape. Nobody filmed it. There is no recording of the single most charming pitch meeting in the history of American animation. It happened in a room and then it stopped existing. I find that mildly infuriating and also completely appropriate. The whole show is like that. Enormous amounts of thought poured into things nobody was ever going to notice. Which brings us, reasonably enough, to where the thing is actually set. Because the town has a real address, sort of. While we're here, it's worth going through what the pilot actually is. Because Help Wanted holds up better than most pilots, and contains more of the finished show than you'd expect. It's 7 minutes. SpongeBob wants a job at the Krusty Krab. Squidward doesn't want him there, and invents an impossible errand to get rid of him, sending him off to find a hydrodynamic spatula with port and starboard attachments and a turbo drive. And SpongeBob, being SpongeBob, simply goes and gets one, and then uses it to feed an enormous bus full of anchovies who have overwhelmed the restaurant. Every single load-bearing element of the series is already in there. The restaurant, the boss who cares about profit, the colleague who resents him, the character's absolute unshakable earnestness being mistaken for stupidity by everyone around him, and then turning out to be the thing that solves the problem. That's a remarkably complete pilot. Most shows take a season to find that. The Tiny Tim song I mentioned earlier plays over the sequence, and it's living in the sunlight, loving in the moonlight, which is a genuinely strange piece of music to put in a cartoon in 1999. It's a 1930s song performed by a man with a ukulele and a falsetto who was famous in the late 60s. Nothing about it is contemporary, and that decision right there in the first 7 minutes tells you exactly what the show's relationship with music is going to be for the rest of its run. A word about the people who made the early episodes, because it wasn't a large operation. Derek Dryman was creative director. Paul Tibbett, who'd eventually run the show, was there from very early. There were writers and storyboard artists including Jay Lender, Sam Henderson, Mark O'Hare, Kent Osborne, Meriwether Williams, and Doug Lawrence. And that group of names comes up over and over in the credits of the episodes people consider the best ones. The production model is worth understanding, because it's unusual and it shows in the finished product. SpongeBob is a storyboard-driven show, which means episodes aren't primarily written as scripts and then drawn. They're worked out in drawings by the artists who pitch the boards and add jokes as they go. There's an outline, and then the board artists build the thing. That's why the physical comedy is so good. The people generating the humour are the people drawing it, which means the jokes are conceived visually rather than described in text and then interpreted. It also explains why the show can go so far into pure animation nonsense. A written script has to justify itself in words. A storyboard just has to be funny on the page. The other early decision that shaped everything was the title cards. Every segment opens on a painted card with the episode name, over a piece of music, usually featuring some object from the story. sitting on a background that has nothing to do with the animation style. Bubbles wipe between scenes with a very specific sound. Neither of those is standard. Both are now so associated with the show that you can identify it from 3 seconds of audio with your eyes shut. And the bubble transition, incidentally, exists partly for a practical reason. It's a clean way of moving between scenes when everything is underwater, and it gives the editors a reliable unit of time. It just also happens to be lovely. 2 other production facts from this era that I enjoy. The first is that the show was made at the Nickelodeon Animation Studio in Burbank, and the executives flew out from New York for the pitch rather than the other way round, which is a small detail that tells you how the meeting was set up. The second is that the pilot had a fully recorded voice track before the name change, which means somewhere in an archive there is presumably a version of Help Wanted where Tom Kenny is saying SpongeBoy instead. Whether that recording still exists in any form, I genuinely don't know, but it was made. It happened. I'd quite like to hear it. I'd also accept never hearing it, because the mop won and the mop was right. As for how the show performed, the numbers have been repeated so often that they stop meaning anything, so I'll do it once and leave it. It became the highest rated series on the network. It became the most distributed property the company had, and it built a merchandising business measured in billions rather than millions. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is how long the ramp was. The first season is not the phenomenon. It's good, it's confident, and it's a moderate success. The explosion happens across the second and third seasons, roughly 2000 to 2003, which is also when the writer's room was firing at a level it arguably never matched again. Ask anyone which episodes are the great ones, and almost everything they name will come from that window. Band Geeks, Graveyard Shift, Chocolate with Nuts, Idiot Box, Rock Bottom, Krusty Krab training video, Dying for Pie. That's a 3-year run of a small team of people who had figured out exactly what they were doing and hadn't yet been asked to do it forever. We'll come back to some of those individually later on. 2 smaller notes to close this bit out. The first is about the pitch itself, which has since become a sort of legend in the industry and gets cited whenever anyone gives advice about pitching. And I gently push back on the lesson people take from it, which is usually something about theatricality. The theatricality wasn't the point. The aquarium wasn't a gimmick. It was a demonstration that the world already existed in his head at a level of detail where he could physically build it. That's what the executives were actually responding to, not the shirts. The fact that a man had spent weeks making tiny furniture for a town that didn't exist yet. You can't fake that with a costume. The second is about how close it came to not happening at all. He was prepared to walk over the age question. If Nickelodeon had held firm, there's a version of history where the whole thing collapses in a meeting room in Burbank over whether a sponge has a job. And the compromise, the boating school, is now one of the most reliably funny running elements in the series, which is a decent argument for compromise generally, and an even better argument for having a specific idea about why your character has to be a certain way, right? The name. Bikini Bottom is named after Bikini Atoll, and it is meant to be more or less directly underneath it. This isn't a theory that took years to crack. It's just something a lot of people never quite joined up, because Bikini Bottom reads as a swimwear joke, and your brain files it there and moves on. Bikini Atoll is a real ring of coral in the Marshall Islands, out in the middle of the Pacific, roughly halfway between Hawaii and Papua New Guinea, 23 islands around a lagoon. And between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 23 nuclear weapons there, starting with a program called Operation Crossroads and ending with the Castle series, which included Castle Bravo, the largest device the Americans ever set off. The people who lived on Bikini were moved off before the testing began. They were told they'd be able to return once it was finished. That did not happen in any meaningful way, and the atoll is still not properly habitable. I'm not going to sit here and do a whole documentary about it, because that's a different video, and this one is meant to help you sleep. But it feels wrong to skate past it entirely. So, that's the real history sitting underneath the name. The swimsuit, incidentally, is named after the same event. The designer Louis Réard launched it in Paris in July 1946, 4 days after the first Crossroads test, and named it after the atoll deliberately because the tests were all over the newspapers. So the word already had this odd double life before anyone put a cartoon under it. Now, for years, the connection between the show and the testing was treated as a fan theory. A very good fan theory, but a theory. The version that circulated on Reddit went further than the name and said the sea life down there talks and builds robots and drives cars because it's mutated. Someone added that chipmunks were among the animals kept aboard Navy vessels during the tests, which is where Sandy comes from, which is a stretch but a fun one. And then a few years ago, the cast sat down for a reunion piece with Esquire, and somebody raised it. Roger Bumpass, who plays Squidward, said he'd always liked the theory that the whole thing was connected to the atomic testing at Bikini Atoll. And Mr. Lawrence, who voices Plankton and has written a great many episodes, said that it was true. Absolutely true. Bumpass's reaction on camera is the best part because he says something like, "It is true? I've been telling people it wasn't true." Lawrence's phrasing was that it was part of the fun of it, the question of how far they were taking the concept. He then went a step further and said the original notion had the human world gone, or in some post-apocalyptic state, with Bikini Bottom being what was left. And that part I'd treat carefully, because it doesn't sit well with the show as it exists. Humans turn up. There's a whole live-action layer. The films go to the surface and interact with people who seem to be having a perfectly ordinary time. So the atomic testing as inspiration seems settled. The end of the world as canon seems like an early idea that got left behind, which happens constantly in television and almost never gets written down. One detail I do like, and I'll flag it as something people point out, rather than something the show has confirmed. The Baker test in July 1946 was detonated underwater, and it threw a column of water thousands of feet into the air. It was photographed extensively, and the photograph is one of the more recognisable images of the 20th century. That specific shape, a wide pillar with a spreading cap, does turn up in the show's explosions fairly often, whether that's deliberate homage or just what an underwater explosion looks like when you draw one. I genuinely couldn't tell you. Let's talk about the town itself, because the design of it is more thought through than it gets credit for. Bikini Bottom is built out of rubbish, not in a grim way. The buildings are pieces of tin and scavenged metal tacked together, and once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. The Krusty Krab is a lobster trap. Mr. Krabs lives in an anchor. There are buildings made out of tin cans, out of boat parts, out of things that fell off the surface and sank. And there's a reading of this that I find quite satisfying, which is that it's exactly what marine life actually does. Octopuses move into bottles and old jars. Hermit crabs use bottle caps. Entire reef communities form on shipwrecks and dumped concrete. If you were designing an underwater town from a marine biologist's perspective, you would absolutely build it out of human debris, because that's the honest answer. There's a further detail on top of that. The tin often looks wavy rather than flat. The suggestion being that's what tidal currents would do to thin sheet metal over time. I have no idea whether any of that was the intent. It might just be that wobbly tin is easier and funnier to draw than straight tin, but it's the kind of coincidence that stops being a coincidence when the person drawing it spent 3 years teaching people what lives in a tide pool. A quick tour of the map, and I'll keep it light. because there's no exam at the end. Conch Street is the residential road with the 3 houses on it, which we'll come back to shortly, because those houses have their own story. Jellyfish Fields is the open grassland outside town, where the jellyfish drift about, and it functions as the show's countryside. Goo Lagoon is the beach, which is a slightly odd concept underwater, and the show has never once acknowledged that. Glove World is the amusement park, themed entirely around gloves, for reasons that remain unexplained and probably shouldn't be explained. Then there's Rock Bottom, which is the trench. It's down a very long bus route, and it's dark, and the residents have their own way of speaking, and the buses don't run on any schedule you can understand. Rock Bottom is doing something real biologically, because the deep sea genuinely is a separate world with separate rules and creatures that look nothing like the ones in the shallows. The episode plays it for anxiety, and it works, but underneath it there's a legitimate point about depth zones. And then there are the other towns, New Kelp City, Las Vegas, places that exist off to the side and get referenced without much ceremony, which tells you the world is meant to be bigger than the one street. The thing I find most interesting about all of this is how little of it is signposted. The atomic history is in the name, and that's it. Nobody in the show mentions it. Nobody ever says the town is built out of rubbish. They just draw it that way, every episode, and let you work it out or not. Which is a decent segue actually, because the 3 most famous buildings in the place were chosen for reasons that are almost aggressively simple. There's a postscript to the Bikini Atoll story that I think deserves saying, because it's the rare piece of nuclear history that isn't entirely grim. The lagoon is, biologically, doing remarkably well. Scientists who have surveyed the reef in recent decades have found substantial coral growth, large fish populations, and a generally thriving system. The reason is straightforward and slightly uncomfortable. Nobody has been allowed to fish there for the better part of 80 years. No boats, no nets, no tourism, no development. It turns out that the single most destructive thing you can do to a reef is not necessarily detonate a bomb over it. It's people continuously for decades. That doesn't undo anything. The people who were displaced are still displaced, and the land is still not safe to properly live on and farm. But the reef itself has become an accidental marine reserve, and it's now studied precisely because it shows what a reef looks like when humans simply leave it alone. So there is weirdly a genuinely thriving underwater community underneath Bikini Atoll, which is not what anyone was going for when they named the town, and it's a nicer coincidence than the show deserves. Right, let's go for a proper wander around the map, because I skimmed it, and it's got more in it than I gave it credit for. Jellyfish Fields is the open ground outside town, and it functions as the countryside. Rolling hills, coral formations, and jellyfish drifting through the air, which is to say the water, in enormous numbers. SpongeBob and Patrick go jellyfishing there with nets, which is the show's version of butterfly catching. The biology behind it is more accurate than it looks. Jellyfish do drift rather than swim in any purposeful sense. They do sting. They do occur in enormous aggregations which are properly called blooms, and a bloom can genuinely stretch for miles. The show's version, where the sky's thick with them, is not far off what a real bloom looks like from underneath. The stinging is treated as a hazard and a hobby simultaneously, which is about right for a cartoon, and also, honestly, about right for jellyfish. They aren't malicious. They aren't anything. They have no brain, no heart, and no blood, and they've been doing this for something like 500 million years, which makes them older than trees. There's a king jellyfish, who is enormous, and whose Latin joke name we've already covered. Goo Lagoon is the beach. And yes, an underwater beach is a contradiction that the show has never once acknowledged, and I've decided to stop being troubled by it. There's sand, there's a lifeguard, there's a pier, and there is water in the water. Larry the lobster is usually there, being alarming about fitness. Glove World is the amusement park themed entirely around gloves. The mascot is a glove. The rides are gloves. There is no explanation, and there is not going to be one. Glove World is the purest expression of the show's willingness to just decide something and commit. The Krusty Krab is shaped like a lobster trap, which is a joke about the customers that took me an embarrassingly long time to notice. Mr. Krabs lives in a hollow anchor with his daughter. The chum bucket is a bucket. There's a Bikini Bottom zoo, which raises the question of which animals are in it and which are looking at them, and which the show is happy to leave alone. Then there's Rock Bottom, which is the one that stays with people. It's down at the bottom of a trench, and you get there by bus. The episode is essentially an anxiety dream. The signs are unreadable, the bus timetable doesn't work, the residents speak with a strange tongue-flicking sound and are perfectly friendly but incomprehensible, and it's dark in a way the rest of the show never is. And underneath the comedy, it's doing something real. Deep sea trenches genuinely are separate worlds. Below a certain depth, the light stops, the pressure becomes crushing, and the creatures that live there are so different from shallow water animals that early naturalists refused to believe the specimens were real. Enormous eyes, or no eyes at all, bioluminescence, bodies that fall apart when brought to the surface because they were never designed to hold themselves together at one atmosphere. The rock bottom residents have big glowing eyes and odd anatomy, and they find the visitor from the shallows to be the strange one, which is exactly the correct perspective. New Kelp City and Las Vegas exist off to the side, mostly as references, and they do useful work by implying that Bikini Bottom is a town in a country rather than a self-contained bubble. There's a wider world with cities in it, and people commute, and there's presumably a government somewhere. Although the show has never established what that government is, and on the one occasion the topic came up, we got King Neptune, which suggests a monarchy based somewhere else entirely. I'd stop pulling on that thread. It doesn't lead anywhere, and there's nothing at the end of it. One last piece of geography that I like a great deal. The show is extremely inconsistent about whether Bikini Bottom is a small town or a large city. In some episodes, it's 3 houses and a restaurant, and everybody knows everybody. In others, there are skyscrapers, traffic, crowds, and a functioning transit system. Both versions are used freely, depending on what the episode needs, and the show has never picked. Which again, is not a mistake, it's the format working exactly as intended. One more thought about the setting before we move indoors. The thing I keep circling back to is how much of Bikini Bottom is an argument about scale that nobody in the show ever makes. The town sits at the bottom of a lagoon in the middle of the largest ocean on the planet. Above it is a surface that the residents almost never think about and can barely reach. Beyond the town is jellyfish fields, and beyond that is essentially nothing. And below it is a trench full of creatures nobody understands. And the entire show takes place in about 4 buildings on one street. That's a completely accurate depiction of what it is like to live anywhere. Most people's actual lives happen inside a radius of about a mile, surrounded by an enormous world they know exists and mostly ignore. The show has built an entire ocean and then set almost everything in a restaurant and 3 houses, and it has never once suggested that the characters are missing out, which strikes me as accurate rather than sad. The residents are not small because the ocean is big. They're just busy. Here's how the most recognisable house in cartoon history got chosen. Hillenburg was drawing possible homes, not for a specific character, just options, things a sea creature could plausibly live inside. And the way he described the decision afterwards is that he imagined laying out 4 objects in front of SpongeBob and asking which one he'd pick. A rock, a pineapple, an Easter Island head, and an old rubber boot. And the answer was the pineapple, because SpongeBob is an optimist and he would like the smell. That's it. That's the whole reasoning. Not symbolism, not marketability, not focus groups. The character would enjoy how it smells. I think about that one a lot, because it's a very specific kind of creative decision. It's not asking what looks good on a lunchbox. It's asking what this person would actually choose, and then trusting that the answer will be funny, which it was. There is, of course, one small problem with it, which Hillenburg would have known better than almost anyone. Real sponges don't have brains. They don't have a nervous system. They cannot smell anything. The reasoning behind the house is biologically impossible for the animal the house belongs to. I choose to find that charming rather than annoying. The man spent years explaining sponges to school children and then gave one a nose out of pure preference. The other two objects on the list both got used, which is the part people tend to forget. The rock went to Patrick, and it's the perfect joke, because Patrick is a starfish who does very little and lives literally under a rock. The phrase already existed in English to describe someone who is oblivious to everything happening around them, and the show just made it physically true and never once winked at it. The Easter Island head went to Squidward. His house is a moai. Those are the enormous carved stone figures on Rapa Nui, out in the Pacific, with the long faces and the heavy brows. The mouth is the front door. The eyes are the upstairs windows, and one of them is his bedroom, while the other is the room where he practices the clarinet with the window open, which is a decision he makes on purpose and which I have opinions about as a neighbour. According to the 2004 book SpongeBob Exposed, the house is built out of volcanic rock, which is at least consistent with the real thing, and the show acknowledges the design directly. In the episode SB 129, Squidward refers to it himself as his Easter Island head, so it's not a sly reference, it's just what it is. His address is 122 Conch Street. SpongeBob is next door at 124. The pineapple, though, has a Polynesian thread running through it that goes deeper than the joke. Hillenburg pulled on Hawaiian and Polynesian imagery constantly, in the music, in the skies, in the tiki-adjacent shapes all over the town. The pineapple recurs in Polynesian design, and it's also a shape that reads instantly at any size, from a poster to a very small toy. The fact that it also happens to be the funniest possible house for a sponge is a bonus. The show did eventually give an in-universe explanation, which it absolutely did not need to, and which I'm glad exists anyway. In Truth or Square, we're told the pineapple fell off a passing ship, sank, and landed in Squidward's garden. SpongeBob, who needed somewhere to live, moved straight in. So Squidward's misery isn't just bad luck. A piece of fruit fell out of the sky and ruined his life, which is a fairly bleak origin story for a running gag, and I don't think the show has ever quite reckoned with it. The interiors are worth a moment too. The pineapple is much bigger inside than it has any right to be. Living room, kitchen, bedroom, a library, a room for Gary, and the layout changes whenever a joke requires it to. That's not sloppiness exactly. It's a house that operates on cartoon physics, and the show is upfront about it. Squidward's place is the opposite. It's tidy, it's tasteful in a way he thinks is tasteful, and it's absolutely covered in self-portraits. He paints himself constantly, in different styles, and hangs the results all over the walls. There's something wonderfully sad about a man who lives alone in a giant stone head surrounded exclusively by pictures of his own face. And then there's Squidville, which is my favourite thing this section has to offer. In the episode of the same name, Squidward finally snaps and moves out. He goes to Tentacle Acres, a gated community, and Tentacle Acres is entirely, uniformly, wall-to-wall moai houses. Identical stone heads in rows, as far as you can see. Only octopuses are allowed in. Everyone is calm, everyone is polite, everyone does the same 3 hobbies. He lasts about a day and a half before it drives him completely round the bend. What I like about it is that it's the show making a point about him that it never says out loud. Squidward doesn't actually want peace and refinement. He wants to be the only refined person in a room full of idiots. Give him a whole suburb of people exactly like himself, and the entire personality collapses. That's a sharper piece of character writing than a cartoon about a sponge is obliged to do. A couple of loose details before we move on. The houses have been alive on more than one occasion. In Home Away from Home, the three of them become sentient and go on an adventure, and Squidward's is named Tiki. In another episode, when SpongeBob starts crying, the moai covers its ears. It's never explained and it doesn't need to be. Squidward's house is also the tallest of the three, which he would want you to know. And originally the moai's mouth was closed, with a separate door sitting underneath it. They changed it so the mouth is the door, which is a much better design, and also means that every time Squidward comes home, he is being swallowed by a giant stone face. Right. Now, one thing I've been dancing around for a while, and it's the single most common piece of misinformation about this show. He's not a squid. Let's go inside the pineapple properly, because the interior is a nice piece of design work that nobody discusses. The ground floor is a living room with a television, a sofa and a foghorn alarm clock. There's a kitchen. Upstairs is the bedroom, with the bed and Gary's food bowl and a chest of drawers. There is also, somewhere in there, a library, which is a very SpongeBob thing to own and never mention. The furniture is where the design gets clever. Almost everything in the house is made of something nautical or something that fell from the surface. The bed is a shell. There are portholes, there's rope. It's the same principle as the town being built out of scrap, applied at the level of soft furnishings. And then there's the employee of the month wall, which is one of my favourite jokes in the entire show precisely because it's never the point of a scene. It's a wall covered in framed photographs, and every single one is SpongeBob, going back years, because he is one of two employees and the other one is Squidward. He's very proud of them. He's also, if you think about it, in a competition. He cannot lose against a man who is not participating. Outside, on the lawn, there's the reef blower. It's a leaf blower for reef debris. It appears in the very first episode, after the pilot, in a segment with almost no dialogue. And it's the show announcing early that it's happy to spend 3 minutes on a wordless gag about a man vacuuming sand. Squidward's house needs one more visit, because I skipped the thing that actually defines it, which is the noise. The moai has an upstairs window that Squidward opens specifically to practice the clarinet. He is not a good clarinetist, that's the joke, and it's a joke the show commits to properly, because the clarinet in the show genuinely does sound like somebody who has been playing for years without improving. Squeaks, missed notes, that flat honking tone you get when the reed isn't right and the player hasn't noticed. His painting is the same. He produces canvas after canvas of himself, in a range of styles, all of them technically fine and none of them interesting, which is a much more precise piece of characterization than bad artist would have been. Squidward isn't untalented. He's competent and unremarkable, and he knows it, and that's considerably worse. The most famous piece is Bold and Brash, which appears in the episode Artist Unknown, and which another character describes, cruelly, as belonging in the rubbish. It has since become a meme in its own right, and there are people who have hung reproductions of it in real houses, which I hope would have pleased him. Sandy's tree dome deserves a proper look too, because it's the only building in the show that's engineered rather than found. It's a glass dome, sealed, filled with air, with a tree in the middle and a wooden house up in the branches. There's an airlock, and visitors from Bikini Bottom have to wear helmets full of water inside it, which is the standard arrangement, reversed, and is one of the show's better recurring images. What I like is that the dome is treated as a genuine feat. Sandy built it. She's an engineer and a scientist, and the show's consistent about this even when it's being silly. She does experiments, she has equipment. The tree dome isn't a quirky home, it's a life support system, and every time SpongeBob walks in without a helmet and starts drying out, the show is reminding you that the two of them live in mutually lethal environments and have decided to be friends anyway. There's an episode where he stays too long and shrivels, and the animation of it is genuinely a bit distressing. The Krusty Krab, meanwhile, is worth walking through as a building. It's shaped like a lobster trap, which we've covered. Inside there's a dining room with wooden tables, a kitchen with the grill, Mr. Krabs' office at the back, and a boat-themed everything. The office is where the money lives, and the show has spent decades finding new ways to demonstrate that Krabs would rather lose almost anything else. The chum bucket across the road is a bucket with a laboratory in it, and the contrast is the entire joke of the street. One building is a trap that catches customers. The other is a container nobody wants to open. A final architectural note that I think is genuinely elegant. The three houses on Conch Street are arranged so that Squidward's is in the middle, not on the end. In the middle, he's physically located between the two people who torment him, with one on each side, and there is no configuration of his home in which he can get away from both of them. That was a choice. Somebody put him there on purpose. And it is structurally the whole character in one decision about where to put a building. A final thought on the houses, which is about what they say rather than what they are. Three neighbours. One lives in a fruit because he likes how it smells. One lives under a rock because he wanted somewhere to lie down. One lives inside a monument, in a stone face carved to look important. Surrounded by paintings of himself. You could not summarise three characters more efficiently if you had a week and a whiteboard. And none of it is ever stated. The houses were designed before the personalities were fully locked, and the personalities grew to match the buildings, which is a much better order to do it in than the sensible one. It's also the reason the establishing shot works. You see three shapes on a street, and you know exactly what kind of afternoon everyone in them is going to have. Squidward Tentacles is an octopus, not a squid, never was. The name has squid in it, his surname is Tentacles, and it's still an octopus, and this has been true since 1999. The reasoning for the design is properly good. Hillenburg chose an octopus specifically because of the mantle. That's the big rounded sac behind an octopus's eyes, which most people assume is its head, and which actually contains most of its organs. Draw that on a character and you get an enormous bulbous dome sitting above the face, which reads instantly as an overinflated ego. The animal's anatomy is doing the characterization before the character has said a word, and then the name. Hillenburg went with Squidward because Octoward sounded ridiculous, which it does. Say it out loud, Octoward. No, so the species is right, and the name is wrong, on purpose, because one of them sounded better. I find that a genuinely defensible trade. The limb count, though, is a pure animation decision. Real octopuses have 8 arms. Squidward has 6. The reason is that 8 was a nuisance to draw and animate, and 6 does the job. He's been 6 his entire existence, and I would guess a solid majority of viewers have never counted. Once you start pulling on this thread, the whole cast comes apart in interesting ways. Pearl is a sperm whale. She's Mr. Krabs' daughter. Mr. Krabs is a crab. The show has never explained this, and as far as I can tell has no intention of ever doing so. There's a mother somewhere in the backstory who is never satisfactorily accounted for, and the series just carries on. But the design of Pearl has a real origin. Hillenburg worked out the character while he was guiding whale watches at the Marine Institute, and there was a whale skeleton exhibit there that fed into it. The reason she has a small body and a comically oversized head is that it's a reference to the sperm whale's brain, which is the largest brain of any animal that has ever lived on this planet. Around 8 kilograms of it. So the daughter of a crab is drawn the way she is as a nod to cetacean neuroanatomy. That is such a Hillenburg thing to do. Plankton is a copepod. Sheldon J. Plankton, specifically, and the plankton part isn't a species, it's a category. Plankton is anything that drifts rather than swims against the current, and it covers thousands of wildly different organisms. A copepod is a tiny crustacean, and copepods are quite possibly the most numerous multicellular animals on Earth. There are staggering numbers of them in every ocean on the planet, which makes the joke better than it looks. The show's villain belongs to the single most abundant group of animals in the sea, and he's the smallest and least significant thing in every room he walks into. He also has one eye, which is a nod to the nauplius larval stage of a copepod, having a single central eye. And here's my favourite biology gag in the entire series, because it took me embarrassingly long to get it. In The Algae's Always Greener, Plankton mentions eating holographic meatloaf for dinner, which is nonsense, except plankton, the actual organisms, largely get their energy through photosynthesis, and a hologram is made of light. So the joke is that he's eating light, which is correct, and it's delivered as a throwaway line in a cartoon and not flagged in any way. There's another one in I'm Your Biggest Fanatic, where the king jellyfish is given the name Cnidaria rex. Cnidaria is the phylum that jellyfish belong to. Rex is Latin for king. It's just king jellyfish, translated into taxonomy, sitting there for anyone who happens to know. Sandy is the outlier, and the show knows it. A squirrel from Texas, living underwater in an air-filled glass tree dome, wearing a diving suit whenever she leaves it. She is the only main character who would die instantly in everyone else's living room, and the only one whose entire life is a piece of engineering. There's a nice symmetry there that the show plays with fairly often, where SpongeBob has to wear a water helmet to visit her, and the two of them are permanently one broken seal away from a very different show. Gary is a sea snail, and he meows. That's the joke, and it never stops being the joke. Sea snails are gastropods. They're real. They're everywhere in tide pools, and they do absolutely nothing that resembles a cat. The show decided he was the household pet, and therefore he makes household pet noises, and it committed so hard that a generation of people now genuinely associate the sound of a cat with a mollusk. Mrs. Puff is a pufferfish, and this is one of the more elegant character-to-species matches in the show, because pufferfish inflate under threat. That's a real defense mechanism, involving them swallowing water to expand into a ball that's harder to swallow. So the driving instructor, who spends every episode being terrified, inflates involuntarily. Her anxiety is her anatomy. You can't design that better. Patrick is a sea star. 5 points, which is standard. Sea stars have no brain, which the show is very comfortable with. They also have no blood, no bones, and they can regrow limbs, all of which turns up in the series at various points, usually as a gag rather than a fact. And the real ecological joke about Patrick, which I'll come back to right at the end of tonight because it deserves the last word. In the actual ocean, sea stars eat sponges. Patrick and SpongeBob are not friends. Patrick is the reason SpongeBob would be having a very bad day. Larry the lobster is a lobster, and lobsters are considerably more aggressive than their public image suggests. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy are, respectively, an elderly man in a shell brassiere and an elderly man in a sailor suit. And their species situation is one nobody has ever tried to resolve. Which brings up a wider point about the town, and I'll say it once. The residents of Bikini Bottom are almost all generic fish drawn in a handful of shapes and recoloured. That's a practical animation choice, but it means the named cast are all, without exception, animals that a marine educator would consider worth explaining. A sponge, a sea star, an octopus, a crab, a copepod, a gastropod, a pufferfish, a whale. It's a tide pool with a fast food restaurant in it. And on that note, let's talk about the restaurant, because the food has 3 separate origin stories, and they don't agree. Since we're on the subject of what these animals actually are, let me go a bit further on sponges, because real sponges are considerably stranger than the cartoon, and I think about them more often than is normal. A sponge is an animal. That's the first thing, And it's the thing most people have to be told twice. It's not a plant. It's not a colony of bacteria. It's a member of the animal kingdom. In the phylum Porifera, which means paw-bearer, it has no brain. No nervous system at all. Not even a simple one. No heart, no blood, no digestive tract, no muscles in any conventional sense. It doesn't move as an adult. It attaches to a surface as a larva and then stays there for the rest of its life, which can be a very long time. Some deep water sponges are estimated to be thousands of years old. What it does is pump water. The whole body is a filtration system. Water is drawn in through thousands of tiny pores, driven by specialized cells with whip-like flagella. Food particles and bacteria are captured, and the filtered water is expelled through larger openings. A sponge the size of a football can move a bathtub of water through itself in a day. And here's the fact that made me put down a book once. If you take a living sponge and push it through a fine mesh, breaking it into individual cells, the cells will find each other again and reassemble into a functioning sponge. Not a new one. That one. The animal survives being turned into a slurry. Nothing else does that. That's not a repair mechanism. That's a different relationship with the idea of being a single organism. There are somewhere in the region of 8,000 to 9,000 described species. Most of them look nothing like the yellow rectangle. They're tubes, barrels, encrusting sheets, branching structures, things that look like glass, things that look like carpet. There is a deep sea group with skeletons of silica that genuinely look like spun glass, and there's a carnivorous family that traps small crustaceans on hooked spicules, which is a sentence I enjoy deploying at parties. The one thing SpongeBob is not is one of them. He's a kitchen sponge. Hillenburg drew him as a natural sponge to begin with, and then went square, because a rectangle with holes in it is funnier to animate, reads better at any size, and has corners you can bend. The trade-off was accuracy, and he made it knowingly, and I think anyone who has ever tried to make a lumpy brown blob emote will agree it was correct. Sea stars are the other one worth doing properly, because Patrick's biology is baked straight into his jokes. A sea star has no brain. It has a nerve ring and radiating nerves, and no central processing at all. It has no blood. It runs on a water vascular system, pumping seawater through internal canals to operate hundreds of tiny tube feet on the underside, which is how it walks. Slowly. It can regenerate, lose an arm, and it grows back. In several species, the severed arm can grow a whole new animal, provided enough of the central disc came with it. And the feeding is the thing everybody should know. Many sea stars eat by pushing their stomach out through their mouth, wrapping it around the food, digesting it externally, and then pulling the stomach back in. That is how they eat clams. They pull the shell open a crack and put their stomach inside it. Patrick in the show is a slow pink man with no discernible thoughts who is very interested in food, which, when you line it up, is not a caricature at all. It's a fairly reasonable summary. A few quicker ones. Octopuses are properly clever. Problem solving, tool use, escaping from containers, recognizing individual humans. Which makes Squidward slightly tragic, because he belongs to the most intelligent invertebrate group on the planet and spends his life operating a cash register badly. Crabs walk sideways because of how their leg joints hinge, and Mr. Krabs does exactly this constantly, which is one of those details that stops being a cartoon movement once you know why. Snails leave a mucus trail and have a rasping tongue called a radula covered in thousands of tiny teeth. Gary is drawn with a proper gastropod foot and a proper shell spiral, and the show has him leaving trails behind him regularly. Barnacles are used throughout the show as a mild swear word. Barnacle heads, barnacles, and so on. And barnacles are genuinely one of the more extraordinary animals in the intertidal zone. They're crustaceans related to crabs that spend their larval stage swimming freely and then glue themselves headfirst to a rock permanently and kick food into their mouths with their legs for the rest of their lives. The adhesive they produce has been studied for decades by people trying to reproduce it, so the show's rudest word is a small upside-down shrimp that cemented its own face to a rock. I'd say that's a fair swear. The last thing to say here is about the incidental fish, which are the population of the town. They're drawn from a small set of body shapes and recoloured, which is how you stuff a city on an animation budget. But the crew gave a lot of them names anyway, internally, and some of those names leaked out into the show and then into the fandom. The most famous of them is Fred, who is a fish whose entire contribution to this series is shouting the words, "My leg," whenever anything is destroyed. He has done this dozens of times. He appears in emergencies purely so that a leg can be injured. The crew leaned into it deliberately once they noticed people had noticed. That's the sort of thing you only get from a storyboard-driven show where the artists are allowed to amuse themselves. And here's a thing that happened in 2021, which I've been saving up. Scientists from the American National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration were operating a remotely operated vehicle at a place called Retriever Seamount off the coast of New England at a depth of about 1,885 meters. Deep water, genuinely deep, cold, dark, unglamorous water. And the camera came across a sponge, a square one, bright yellow, sitting on the rock, and immediately next to it, a pink sea star with 5 points. They were shared as part of a live broadcast and went round the world within about a day for obvious reasons. The detail that makes it, though, comes from the marine biologists who commented on it afterwards. In the real ocean, sea stars eat sponges. That's a straightforward predator and prey relationship. The pink one was not sitting next to the yellow one out of friendship. So the actual literal photographed version of SpongeBob and Patrick, found nearly 2 kilometers down in the Atlantic, entirely by accident, is a slow-motion murder in progress. I suspect Hillenburg would have found that funnier than anyone. A closing note on the biology, since I've been enthusiastic about it for a while. The show has never once presented itself as educational. That matters. Hillenburg was explicit that he wasn't making a teaching program, and if he had been, it would have been a considerably worse show, and nobody would remember it. What he did instead was let the accuracy sit underneath the jokes, without drawing attention to it. The octopus has an ego because of its mantle. The pufferfish is anxious because it inflates. The copepod is small because copepods are small. The whale has a big head because whales have big brains. None of that is explained, it's just true, and it makes the character work. And if you happen to know why, you get a second joke for free. Which is exactly what the Intertidal Zone was doing with school children in the 80s, at a much smaller scale, with a photocopier. The method never changed, only the budget. The Krabby Patty is the most protected fictional recipe in television, and nobody has ever satisfactorily explained what's in it. We do have one solid answer though, and it comes straight from Hillenburg. The patties are vegan. He said so directly, in response to people theorising about it, and it makes complete sense once you think about the setting. The customers are fish, the staff are a sponge and an octopus. A beef patty would require a cow, which would require dry land, and a burger made of any local ingredient would be deeply uncomfortable for everyone eating it. So it's a plant burger, in an underwater town, sold by a crab. The generally understood build, which SpongeBob rattles off in the episode Pickles, runs from the bottom bun upward. Patty, lettuce, cheese, onion, tomato, ketchup, mustard, pickles, top bun. Whether the show has stuck to that order consistently is another matter entirely. It hasn't. But that's the official version, and I appreciate that a cartoon bothered to have one. The formula, though, the actual secret, that's where things get properly tangled, because the show has told us where it came from, at least 3 times, and the answers are incompatible. Version 1 is the big one. It's in Friend or Foe, which opened the 5th season in April 2007, and it's the closest thing the series has to a foundational text. Crabs and plankton were friends. Childhood friends, in fact. Two small, poor, unpopular kids in Bikini Bottom who decided together that they were going to open a restaurant and stop being either of those things. And they went into business as partners. Their first product was chum, which, if you don't know, is the real word for chopped up fish and offal that gets thrown into the water to attract predators. It is bait. It is emphatically not food. And they served it to a customer, Old Man Jenkins, who became violently ill. That failure is what breaks them. They fall out over it. They fall out over who's responsible. And the argument escalates into a fight over the recipe itself, with each of them physically pulling at it. The story is told twice in the episode, once by crabs and once by plankton, and the two versions contradict each other in exactly the way you'd expect. In Crabs' telling, plankton is power mad. In plankton's telling, Crabs is greedy. Karen eventually gives the neutral account, and in the middle of the fight, a shelf of ingredients collapses into the batter. That's the formula. It's an accident that happened during the argument that ended their friendship. Which means, and the show is quite deliberate about this, Plankton is partly responsible for the creation of the thing he has spent his entire adult life trying to steal. He was in the room. He was pulling on the other end of it. And he doesn't know. That's a better piece of writing than a Saturday morning cartoon needs. It reframes the entire running gag as a man trying to reclaim something he genuinely helped make from a friend who left him behind. And it's sitting inside an episode where the punchline is chum poisoning. Version 2 says the formula is a family recipe. This turns up in Enemy In-Law, and it's stated flatly, as though there's no ambiguity at all. Version 3 goes further back still. In Dunces and Dragons, SpongeBob and Patrick get flung into a medieval version of Bikini Bottom, and the Krabby Patty is already there, being served by King Krabs, an ancestor. So the recipe predates Mr. Krabs by centuries. None of these can be true at the same time. And I want to be clear that I don't think this is a flaw. Real recipes work exactly like this. Ask any family where a particular dish came from, and you'll get 3 confident, mutually exclusive answers, all delivered by people who were definitely there. The show has accidentally reproduced how food history actually behaves, which is to say badly, loudly, and with everyone certain. There's also the small matter of the restaurant itself having competing origins. One account has the Krusty Krab starting life as a retirement home, called the Rusty Crab, which Krabs bought and converted. Another has Mr. Krabs as a former pirate whose ship became the building, and there's a version where he sold the ship, and the resemblance is coincidence. The building is shaped like a lobster trap, which is its own quiet joke about what going into that restaurant actually means for the customers. He's also a Navy man. That comes up repeatedly. He loves sailing, sea shanties, whales, and talking like a pirate, and Clancy Brown's performance leans on all of it constantly. A few operational details about the Krusty Krab that I think are underrated. There's a patty vault. Just one bite establishes that the restaurant keeps an enormous stockpile of Krabby Patties in a secure underground room, which raises questions about food safety that the episode does not touch. The same episode establishes that the patties are addictive, which raises considerably worse questions. The staffing is 2 people, a fry cook and a cashier. That's the entire workforce of the most popular restaurant in town, and the reason is straightforwardly that Krabs will not pay for a third. The show has him charging his employees for things that are not chargeable: breathing, standing, existing on the premises. And SpongeBob loves the job. Not tolerates, loves. He has an Employee of the Month wall in his house, covered in his own face, going back years. And he's the only person eligible. Across the road in a metal bucket is the other restaurant. The chum bucket sells chum. That's the same substance that put Old Man Jenkins in a bad way at the very beginning. Plankton never stopped selling it. Decade after decade of a man running a restaurant whose signature dish is bait, refusing to change the menu, and blaming the competition. There's something almost admirable about that level of commitment to a bad idea, which is a fair place to cross the road properly, because Plankton and his wife are more interesting than the villain slot usually allows. The rest of the menu deserves attention, because the show has built out a whole cuisine and mostly done it in the background. There are kelp fries, which is exactly what it sounds like, coral bits, kelp shakes, which get an entire episode where the town becomes addicted to them and turns green, shornut butter, barnacle chips, crusty combo meals. There's a menu board visible in most Krusty Krab scenes, and the items on it have been reasonably consistent for decades, which is more effort than the format required. And then there are the various Krabby Patty variants that get invented and abandoned. Pretty patties which are coloured and sell magnificently, and then turn out to have side effects. The Krusty Dog, which is the hot dog experiment. The Sailor's Surprise. Most of these exist for one episode and then vanish, in the way that fast food menu items actually do. The pricing is a running joke I've always enjoyed. Mr. Krabs charges what he can get away with and adjusts it constantly. He has charged for napkins, he has charged for the air customers breathe on the premises. In one episode, he sells the restaurant. In another, he opens a second location and immediately regrets the overhead. He is, and I mean this sincerely, one of the better comic depictions of a small business owner in television. Not a cartoon capitalist in the abstract, which is easy. A specific, recognizable type. The man who built something himself, works constantly, cannot delegate, cannot spend, and treats every expense as a personal wound. Which brings me to the formula's physical form, because the show made a strange and good decision there. The secret formula exists as an object. It's a bottle, usually, sealed and kept in a safe. So the recipe has been reduced to a physical thing that can be stolen, which is the only way the running gag works, and which means Mr. Krabs is one breaking away from losing everything permanently. That's a genuinely fragile position for a business to be in, and the show has never treated it as a problem worth solving. There's an episode where the formula's contents are shown to be blank, or a joke, or a lie, depending on which one you're watching. This is another case where the answers don't reconcile, and the show doesn't care. The theft attempts themselves are worth cataloguing briefly, because the variety is genuinely impressive. Plankton has tried mind control on the town and on individuals. He has built a robot version of Mr. Krabs. He has built a robot version of SpongeBob. He has disguised himself as a Krabby Patty. He has disguised himself as a customer, a health inspector, a bus, a piece of furniture. He has shrunk himself further, which was already unnecessary. He has attempted to be genuinely nice to people as a strategy, which unsettled everyone. He has emerged from a birthday cake, which is how the flashback episode we discussed earlier opens. He has come out of that cake more than once, actually. The man has a signature move, and he is not letting it go. And the failures follow a pattern. He almost never loses because someone is smarter than him. He loses because he stops to enjoy winning. That's a consistent character trait across hundreds of episodes, and it's the most human thing about him. One more restaurant detail that I've come to appreciate more with age. SpongeBob's relationship with the job is the strangest and most quietly radical thing in the show. He is not resigned to his work. He is not doing it while dreaming of something else. He genuinely, sincerely, uncomplicatedly loves being a fry cook. He is excellent at it. He treats each patty as a piece of craft. He arrives early. He is upset by holidays. And the show never once mocks him for it. It mocks him for plenty of other things. It puts him through every possible indignity. But the central premise, that a person can find complete fulfillment in a low-paid service job because they are good at it and it matters to them, is treated as entirely valid and never undercut. Squidward who considers himself superior, is the miserable one. SpongeBob, who considers a hamburger worth doing properly, is not. I don't think that was a thesis. I think it came from a man who had actually worked in a seafood kitchen and knew that some people love that work. But it sits underneath the entire series, and it's a large part of why the thing is so pleasant to have on. Nobody in Bikini Bottom is trying to escape their life. They're just having a Tuesday. 2 more Krusty Krab things, and one of them ended up in an actual courtroom. The first is the pizza. In a first season episode, Mr. Krabs decides to sell pizza. SpongeBob and Squidward have to deliver one, and the delivery goes catastrophically wrong in the desert. Along the way, SpongeBob sings a very short song about the Krusty Krab pizza being for you and me, which is 11 words long and which an extraordinary number of people can produce on demand decades later. The episode is also where Squidward gets one of his rare moments of genuine decency, which the show then immediately punishes. The second is the trademark case. In the mid-2010s, a company in Texas set about opening a seafood restaurant and decided to call it the Krusty Krab. They applied to register the name. Viacom, who owned the show, objected on the grounds that the Krusty Krab is theirs, and it went to court. The interesting legal question was whether a fictional location inside a television program can be a protected trademark, given that nobody had ever sold anything under that name in the real world. The restaurant had never existed. It was a drawing of a lobster trap. The courts decided it could. Viacom won, and the decision was upheld on appeal in 2018. The reasoning came down to how strongly the public associates the name with the show, and the answer, as anyone could have predicted, was extremely strongly. So there is now case law about a fictional underwater hamburger restaurant, which is not something I expected to find when I started reading about this, and which I enjoyed enormously. There are, incidentally, unofficial Krusty Krab restaurants that have opened in various parts of the world over the years, generally without permission, and generally not for very long. And then there's the other thing, which is that a single line of dialogue from that same corner of the show became one of the most widely used phrases on the internet. Patrick answering a phone and being asked whether this is the Krusty Krab, and saying no, this is Patrick, has been repurposed millions of times as a template for a certain kind of deliberately unhelpful response. It's a throwaway gag from a first season episode. It has outlived most of the websites it was posted on. The chum bucket is, by any reasonable measure, a failing business. It's a large metal bucket with a laboratory in the back. It has no customers. Its product is inedible, and everyone in town knows it. And its owner is a one-eyed copepod, roughly the height of a thumbnail, who's been running it without meaningful revenue for the entire length of the series. What keeps it open, as far as anyone can tell, is spite. Plankton is a skilled inventor. That part is consistently true and rarely commented on. He builds robots, mind control devices, submarines, disguises, cloning equipment, and an alarming quantity of weaponry, all out of the back of a failing restaurant. If he applied any of it to anything other than a hamburger recipe, he would run Bikini Bottom inside a fortnight. He is not, in any technical sense, incompetent. He's just entirely focused on the wrong problem. The show is quite explicit that his real driver is size. He has, in the description the series itself uses, a Napoleon complex, and it's earned. He's the smallest character in the show by an enormous margin. He was the smallest kid in the flashbacks, and the thing he wants isn't money, it's to have won. Then there's Karen. Karen is a supercomputer. Plankton built her. She's also his wife, and the show has never treated that as strange, which I've always appreciated. There's no episode where anyone points at her and says, hang on, she's just his wife. And she happens to be a wall-mounted computer with a screen for a face, and she has better ideas than he does. The dynamic is the funniest thing in that half of the show. Plankton comes up with a plan. Karen tells him the plan is stupid. Plankton does it anyway. Karen watches it fail from the wall and does not soften the follow-up. She's the smartest character in the series, and she's married to the man who is most consistently wrong. Now here's a real-world layer that I think is lovely. Karen is voiced by Jill Talley. Tom Kenny voices SpongeBob. Talley and Kenny are married in real life. Have been for a very long time. So the show's married couple is played by an actual married couple, except she's playing the wife of the villain, and he's playing the target of the villain's plans, which means every episode where Plankton and Karen are plotting against SpongeBob involves a wife scheming against her own husband in a recording booth. I don't know whether that ever came up over dinner. I hope it did. Plankton is voiced by Doug Lawrence, who works under the name Mr. Lawrence. And he is one of the more unusual figures in the production because he's not only in the cast, he's a writer, has been for years. He's written a great many episodes of the show. He was involved in developing both spin-off series, and he's the person who confirmed the Bikini Atoll business we talked about earlier. So the villain is written and performed by the same man, which is why the character has a consistency that a lot of long-running cartoon antagonists lose. Nobody has to interpret Plankton. He's coming from one place. Here's the part that genuinely surprised me when I dug into it, though. Plankton was never meant to be important. In the development material, before the show existed, he was outlined as a possible minor villain. Something for 1 or 2 episodes. A recurring nuisance at most. And Karen was going to be even less than that. Essentially, just a piece of equipment he owned. A computer he talked to. Lawrence has said they didn't really become main characters until after the 3rd season. And on paper, in the billing, it took even longer than that. The two of them weren't promoted to main cast in the credits until the first film in 2004. 5 years of the show existing with the villain and his wife formally listed as supporting players. That's an enormous amount of ground to cover for a bit part. The character grew because he worked, which is how most of the best things in television happen and almost never how they're planned. And it's gone further since. In 2025, Netflix put out Plankton, the movie, which is a feature film about him. The 1 or 2 episode idea now has more screen time to his name than most of the original cast. There's a whole conversation to be had about the recent films, and I'll get to it properly later on, so I won't jump ahead. 2 more things about the chum bucket before we move on. The first is that the show occasionally lets Plankton win, and those episodes are always the best ones. Not win permanently, obviously, but get there. And when he gets the formula, the thing that undoes him is never SpongeBob outsmarting him. It's Plankton himself, doing something stupid at the last second, usually out of gloating. He is his own opposition. The second is that he and Krabs are, underneath everything, 2 men who fell out about a business decision 40 years ago and never spoke about it properly. Every scheme is a conversation they refuse to have. The show has been running that joke since long before it explained where it came from, and it's why the reveal landed as well as it did. Right, enough plot. Let's talk about the people saying all of this out loud in a room, because the voice cast is one of the more remarkable groups ever assembled for a cartoon. Plankton's laboratory deserves a proper look, because the sheer volume of technology in that bucket is absurd. He builds robots constantly, chum-based delivery systems, analysis machines designed to break down a Krabby Patty into its components, which fail every time for reasons the show never explains, and which I suspect is simply that the plot requires it. Shrink rays, growth rays, a device for entering someone's brain, a time machine on at least one occasion. And the recurring detail I find funniest is that he almost always builds the thing successfully. The engineering works. It's the plan around the engineering that collapses. He has also, repeatedly, built other computers, which is a delicate area given the marriage. Karen herself has changed physically over the years. She's been a wall-mounted unit, a mobile unit on wheels, a screen on a stand, and various upgrades in between. And the show treats her hardware the way it treats everything else, which is to say, inconsistently and without comment. Her personality has never changed at all. She has been dry, unimpressed and correct since her first appearance. There's an episode built entirely around their anniversary, and the shape of it tells you a lot. It's played straight as a domestic story. He forgets, or he gets it wrong, or he prioritizes a scheme over her, and the fallout is the fallout of an actual relationship. The fact that one participant is a computer and the other is a millimeter tall is never the joke. The joke is that he's a bad husband in a very ordinary way. That's a strange amount of texture for a villain in a children's cartoon, and it's why he lasted. Plankton also has family. There's an extended clan of relatives who turn up occasionally, most of them variations on the same design, most of them larger and stupider than him, and living in less impressive circumstances. There's a cousin who eats things. There's a grandmother. The family reunions are chaos, and Plankton's mortification at his own relatives is a reliable engine for a segment. The Chum Bucket's business model, meanwhile, remains unexamined by everyone including the show. He has no customers. This is stated repeatedly. The restaurant is empty, and yet there is always money for another robot, which suggests either an enormous amount of inherited capital or a level of debt that would be genuinely alarming if anyone in Bikini Bottom did credit checks. There are episodes where he gets customers, usually by cheating, and what happens in those episodes is instructive, because on the occasions when he does succeed at running a restaurant, he almost immediately loses interest. The restaurant isn't the goal. It was never the goal. The goal is the other restaurant, which is the sad version of the character, and the show gets there occasionally and then backs away, because it isn't that sort of show most weeks. There's one more thing about Mr. Lawrence that I want to put on the record, because it's unusual in the industry. The dual role of writer and performer means Plankton's dialogue is written by the person who has to say it, which produces a very particular rhythm. Villain speeches that build and then collapse into something petty. The delivery is theatrical, then suddenly domestic, then back again. That switch is much harder to write for someone else than it is to write for yourself. Lawrence has been with the show since the beginning. He was one of the developers on both spin-off series, and he's the person who has ended up doing a lot of the public explaining about what the show is and where things came from, which is presumably why he was the one who confirmed the thing about the atoll while the rest of the cast sat there looking at him. And the last point about Plankton is a structural one. Every long-running comedy needs an engine, and the engine has to be something that can never be resolved. The Krabby Patty formula is a perfect one, because there is no version of the show where Plankton gets it and keeps it. The moment he wins permanently, the series is over. So a man who was penciled in for 1 or 2 episodes ended up being the mechanism that lets the show run indefinitely. That's not a bad career for a cope pod. A last handful of details from the bucket. Plankton's height is given, in various places, as roughly an inch, which makes almost every physical interaction in the show a logistical problem the animators have had to solve creatively. He gets picked up. He gets flicked. He has been carried away on the sole of a shoe. The comedy of scale is doing a lot of work, and it requires constant staging effort that nobody watching ever notices. His full name is Sheldon J. Plankton, and the Sheldon is used specifically when someone wants to make him feel small, which is a nice piece of writing discipline. Karen's delivery, meanwhile, is one of the more subtle performances in the show. Jill Talley plays her almost entirely flat. No villain relish, no cackling, no enthusiasm. It's the voice of somebody reading out a fact they have already explained twice, and it's funny precisely because everything around her is enormous. The contrast is the joke. He shouts, she doesn't, and she's right. There's also the matter of what the Chum Bucket actually is, structurally, which is that it's an evil lair pretending to be a restaurant. The dining area is minimal. The laboratory is enormous. The proportions tell you exactly where the priorities are, and no health inspector in Bikini Bottom has ever raised it. And finally, the thing that makes the whole arrangement work. Plankton is never genuinely frightening. He's a threat in the way that a wasp is a threat. Annoying, persistent, occasionally successful, and fundamentally not a danger to anyone's life. That's the correct calibration for a show that people put on to fall asleep to, and it was arrived at by accident, by a team who are just trying to make a small angry man funny. There's a thing Tom Kenny does with SpongeBob's laugh that nobody has ever successfully copied. It's not a laugh so much as a sound effect, somewhere between a foghorn, a dolphin, and a rusty gate. And the reason it works is that it's built out of an actual person rather than assembled from scratch. Elements of Kenny's own personality went into the character deliberately. The enthusiasm is his. The eagerness is his. Turned up considerably, obviously, but the raw material is a real bloke. Kenny came to the show the same way half the crew did, which is through Rocco's Modern Life. His animation career started there, alongside Hillenburg's, and when Hillenburg needed someone for the lead, he already knew who he was calling. What people underestimate is how much of the show Kenny's actually doing. He's SpongeBob, obviously. He's also Gary, which means he's doing the meowing. He's the French narrator, that low, breathy voice doing the nature documentary parody over the title cards, which is a Jacques Cousteau impression and one of the show's best-running ideas. And he's Patchy the Pirate, in the live-action segments, in a red beard and a hat, in what appears to be a house in Encino. So a substantial proportion of any given episode is one man in a booth talking to himself. Clancy Brown is Mr. Krabs, and Clancy Brown is the piece of casting that makes the least sense on paper and the most sense in practice. This is a man best known for playing enormous, menacing characters. The Kurgan in Highlander, Captain Hadley in The Shawshank Redemption. Genuinely frightening presences. And he plays a small red crab who says money in a nautical, Scottish adjacent bark that exists nowhere on Earth. It's a huge performance. Krabs is never underplayed, and you can hear that he's enjoying it, which matters more in voice work than almost anything else. Roger Bumpass is Squidward, and I'd argue it's the hardest job on the show. Squidward's entire register is exhaustion. He has to be tired, superior, put upon and still funny, in a nasal drone, for hundreds of episodes, without ever tipping into being unpleasant to listen to. That's a real technical achievement. Bumpass was also the first cast member to receive an Emmy nomination for the show, back in 2012. Bill Fagerbakker is Patrick, and Patrick is deceptively difficult too. Stupidity is easy to play badly. What Fagerbakker does is play him warm. Patrick is never mean-spirited. He's just running about 4 seconds behind everyone else, and the voice carries a genuine sweetness underneath it. Fagerbakker came from live action, most famously as Dorber on Coach, which is a completely different world. Carolyn Lawrence does Sandy, accent and all. Mary Jo Catlett is Mrs. Puff. Laurie Allen is Pearl. And a group of people, including D. Bradley Baker, Serena Irwin, Bob Joles, Mark Fite and Thomas F. Wilson, provide the entire rest of the population, which is hundreds of fish. D. Bradley Baker, in particular, deserves recognition, because if you've watched the show, you've heard him thousands of times, and you've almost certainly never once identified him. He does the background, the crowds, the animals, the screaming. Then there's the pair I find genuinely touching. Mermaid Man was voiced by Ernest Borgnine. Barnacle Boy was voiced by Tim Conway. Borgnine was an Academy Award winner. Conway was one of the great American sketch comedians. Both of them were well into their 70s when the show started, and they played 2 retired superheroes living in a nursing home called Shady Shoals, mostly asleep, occasionally getting up to fight crime badly. The casting is the joke. You've got 2 men who were genuinely part of a previous era of American entertainment playing two men who are genuinely part of a previous era of superheroics and being gently ribbed for it. And they're clearly in on it, and clearly having a wonderful time. Borgnine kept playing Mermaid Man until he died in 2012, aged 95. The guest list, meanwhile, is one of those things that sounds made up when you read it in a row. David Bowie, Betty White, Amy Poehler, Aubrey Plaza, Dennis Quaid, Christopher Guest, Bob Barker, Johnny Knoxville, Adam West, and Burt Ward, which is to say, the actual Batman and Robin from the 1960s series, turning up in a show that spends most of its time affectionately taking that exact thing apart. Charles Nelson Riley as the Dirty Bubble, which is a villain who is a bubble. Not all of these are large roles. Several are one line. But the fact that David Bowie was in an episode of a cartoon about a sponge is a sentence that improves the world. Kenny, for his part, has picked up both an Annie Award and an Emmy for the role. The Annie came earlier, in 2010, which was the first time any cast member had won that particular award for the show. The Emmy came in 2018. One thing I want to flag because I think it explains a lot about why the performances hold up. Most of the main cast have been there since 1999. Not mostly, not with some replacements, the same people. Kenny, Bumpass, Fargabacker, Brown, Lawrence, Tally, Carolyn Lawrence, Catlett, Allen. That's a working relationship measured in decades, and it's audible. When crabs and plankton argue, that's two men who have been arguing in that room since before some of the people watching were born. Voice cast turnover is normal in long-running animation. Actors leave, actors die, characters get recast, and the show quietly hopes nobody notices. That this one has largely avoided it is unusual, and it's a big part of why an episode from 2024 sounds like an episode from 2001, even when the animation and the writing have moved considerably. And since we're on the subject of sound, the music in this show is far stranger than it needs to be, and I want to spend proper time on it. I want to spend a bit longer on Patchy the Pirate, because he's the strangest thing the show has ever committed to, and most people have half forgotten he exists. Patchy is a live-action character. He's the president of the SpongeBob fan club. He wears a red beard and a pirate hat, and he lives in what is very obviously an ordinary house in the San Fernando Valley with a parrot puppet called Potty. He appears in the specials, framing the animated content, and his segments have absolutely nothing to do with anything happening underwater. He is also played by Tom Kenny, without a beard of his own, doing a completely different voice. What makes Patchy genuinely odd is that the show gives him continuity. He has ongoing storylines across specials. He has a relationship with Potty that deteriorates and recovers. He has a mother. He goes on quests. He is, at various points, a man having a nervous breakdown in his own front garden about a cartoon. There's a whole live-action mythology sitting alongside the animated one, running for years, that almost nobody thinks about when they think about SpongeBob. And it exists because somebody decided that a children's special needed a framing device, and then nobody ever stopped them. The French narrator is the other Kenny performance that carries more weight than people realise. That voice, the low murmuring one that says things like, "Ah, the sea," over a still shot of nothing, is doing a Jacques Cousteau impression. Cousteau's documentaries in the 60s and 70s were the defining popular presentation of the ocean for an entire generation, and the specific quality of them, the reverent slow pacing and the accented English, is precisely what the narrator is parodying, but it's affectionate rather than mocking, and it does real structural work. The narrator handles the time cards, sets scenes, occasionally comments, and once or twice becomes a character in his own right. He is the show's only voice of authority, and he is completely unreliable. A few other performance details that I like. The clarinet you hear from Squidward is played rather than synthesized, and it's played to sound bad, which is a much harder brief than playing well. There's a difference between an instrument sounding wrong and a person sounding wrong on an instrument, and the show consistently gets the second one. Mr. Krabs' laugh is another Clancy Brown invention, and it's not a laugh so much as a series of hard vocal barks. He's described his approach to the character as coming from a place of scale, playing a small creature with an enormous voice, which is why Krabs always sounds like he's addressing a ship. Bill Fagerbakker has said Patrick isn't stupid so much as unencumbered, which is a lovely way to put it, and also, if you listen, exactly how he plays him. And Carolyn Lawrence's Sandy accent is a real regional register rather than a generic cartoon Texan, which matters more than it sounds like it does, because a bad one would have made the character insufferable within 3 episodes. The guest star situation gets stranger the more of it you look at. Adam West and Burt Ward turning up is the one that gets me. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy are unmistakably an affectionate parody of the 1960s Batman series. 2 costumed heroes, one older and one younger, a shared vehicle, a rogues gallery of absurd villains, an aesthetic that was already dated when it was new. And then the show hired the actual Batman and Robin from that series to appear in it. That's a level of self-awareness that most cartoons cannot manage without breaking. The villains in that strand deserve a mention too. Man Ray, the dirty bubble who is a bubble, and who was voiced by Charles Nelson Riley, an actor with one of the most recognisable voices in American television. The Atomic Flounder. Every one of them is a parody of a specific kind of 60s comic book nonsense, and the show plays them completely straight. There's an episode where Man Ray, having been rehabilitated, has to learn to be good, and SpongeBob teaches him with a wallet on a string. It's one of the funniest things in the series, and it's essentially a sketch about behavioural conditioning. Right, one final observation about the cast, and then I'll leave them alone. The reason the show sounds so consistent is not just that the people stayed, it's that they record in a way that lets them play off each other, rather than each performer coming in alone and reading lines into a void. You can hear it. The overlaps, the reactions, the moments where a character laughs at something another character has just done. That's much harder to fake than people assume, and it's the difference between a cast and a group of individually excellent voice actors who have never met. 27 years of the same people in the same room, arguing about a hamburger. One more pass on the cast because several of them have careers elsewhere that are worth knowing about. Tom Kenny is one of the most prolific voice actors alive. He is the Ice King in Adventure Time, which is a completely different and considerably sadder performance. He was the mayor in the Powerpuff Girls. He has been in an enormous proportion of American animation since the mid-90s, and if you have watched cartoons at all in the last 30 years, you have heard him a great many times without knowing. Roger Bumpass was Professor Membrane in Invader Zim, which is another nasal, self-important, entirely different character, and it's a useful comparison because it shows how much of Squidward is construction rather than just his natural voice. Bill Fagerbakker came out of live-action television and theatre, and has done a substantial amount of dramatic work, which is not what you'd guess from Patrick. Mary Jo Catlett had a long career before Mrs. Puff, including a run on Different Strokes and work on Broadway going back decades. And Clancy Brown, alongside the very large and very frightening roles, has one of the most extensive voice credits in the industry, including a substantial run as Lex Luthor. The point isn't the trivia, the point is that this is not a cast of people who only do this. It's a group of working professionals with long careers who happen to have spent a very large chunk of their careers on the same show, and who by every account still enjoy it. You can hear that too in a way that's difficult to explain and impossible to fake. There's a difference between a performance delivered by someone doing their job and a performance delivered by someone who finds the thing funny. This cast still find it funny. The theme song is a sea shanty, not shanty-ish, not sea adjacent, an actual sea shanty in structure, built on call and response and modelled on a real one called Blow the Man Down. That's a genuine 19th century halyard shanty, the kind sung by crews hauling on ropes. And if you go and listen to it, the bones of the SpongeBob theme are sitting right there in it. The melody was composed by Mark Harrison and Blaze Smith. The lyrics were written by Hillenburg and Derek Dryman, the same man who wore the second Hawaiian shirt into the pitch meeting, and it's performed by a painting. Painty the Pirate is the oil painting at the start of every episode, with the mouth cut out and a real human mouth moving inside it. That mouth belongs to Patrick Pinney. Pinney sang the theme, and as far as the main series goes, voiced nothing else. He turned up, did the most recognisable 44 seconds in children's television, and that was his contribution. The opening line has a real origin too, which I didn't expect. "Are you ready, kids?" is something Hillenburg used to say to children while playing a sailor at events at the Marine Institute. So the first words of the theme song are a line he'd been using on school groups years before any of this existed. But the best piece of information about the theme song is Dryman's account of the brief. According to him, Hillenburg's idea was to make the most annoying song you possibly could. The specific image was Saturday morning, children turning the television on, parents trying to sleep in the other room, and a pirate bellowing at their kids to jump on the floor. Which is a very funny thing for me to be reading out to you at this hour, given what this video is for. The song was engineered to prevent sleep. We are using the resulting franchise to cause it. I'd like to think he'd find that acceptable. The songwriters have since been properly recognised for it. In May 2021, they received the Top Television Series Award at the ASCAP Film and Television Music Awards, which is a formal industry acknowledgement that the annoying pirate song won. Now, the score. This is the part I think is genuinely fascinating and almost nobody talks about. Most of the background music in SpongeBob isn't original. It comes from the Associated Production Music Library, which is a production music catalogue. Library music. Tracks recorded often decades ago for the express purpose of being licensed to whoever needs 60 seconds of tension or a bit of jaunty nonsense. This is where Rocko's Modern Life got a lot of its music too, and it's where The Adventures of Pete and Pete drew from, which is why those three shows have a family resemblance in the ear even though they look nothing alike. The library is full of old recordings, mid-century British light orchestral pieces, corny Hawaiian numbers, big dramatic orchestral stings recorded for films that never happened. And the show uses them, largely straight, for comic effect, because there is something inherently funny about a genuine 1950s dramatic orchestra swelling over a sponge dropping a spatula. Hillenburg has said much of the show's musical identity was inspired by 1950s Hawaiian steel guitar. And that's the sound, the slide, that wobbling, bending, slightly seasick tone that goes over the transitions and the time cards. Traditional Hawaiian melodies turn up throughout, including Aloha O'o, which is a real song written by Queen Liliuokalani of Hawaii. Sea shanties are all over it as well. Drunken Sailor is, by a wide margin, the single most used piece of music in the series. There's a ukulele version of 12th Street Rag that runs under an enormous number of scenes. Nicholas Carr is the music editor and the show's main composer, and he's another Rocko alumnus. He'd struggled to find work after that show ended, and was apparently considering leaving the field entirely when Hillenburg offered him the job, which is a nice thing to have happened to somebody. The specific piece of his work that everyone knows, and nobody knows they know, is the lap steel stings. Those short sliding guitar phrases that play over the transitions and the time cards, 5 of them, composed by Carr, and they're so embedded in the show's grammar that you can hear them right now, without me playing anything. That's the sound of 3 hours later. Jeremy Wakefield is the other name here. He's the man behind a huge amount of the steel guitar work, alongside Carr and Sage Guyton, and between them they built an entire sonic identity out of an instrument that had been unfashionable for about 40 years. Which leaves one song, and it's the one that ended up somewhere nobody could have predicted. Band Geeks is a second season episode where Squidward, in an attempt to humiliate an old rival, assembles a marching band out of the residents of Bikini Bottom. They're catastrophically bad, and then at the actual performance, at an event called the Bubble Bowl, they play a song called Sweet Victory, and they're magnificent. The song is real, it was written and recorded before the show existed, and the original vocal was by David Glen Eisley, who came in and performed SpongeBob singing for the sequence. The episode is routinely voted the best of the entire series, and the reason is that the payoff is played completely straight. There's no joke undercutting it, the band is just good, and Squidward's face when he realises is one of the few genuinely emotional moments in the show. That episode ends up mattering later on, in a way nobody involved in 2001 could have seen coming, but I'll leave that where it belongs, which is at the end of tonight. For now, let's go somewhere odder, because there's a category of episode that got complicated after the fact. The show has produced a genuinely surprising number of original songs, and I want to go through some of them, because they're one of the things people remember longest. Ripped Pants comes from the first season. SpongeBob splits his trousers at the beach. Everyone laughs, and he builds an entire comedy career on doing it repeatedly until people get bored and turn on him. Then he sings a mournful song about it, on a beach at sunset, accompanied by a guitar. It is a genuinely good song, and it's about the specific hollowness of being funny for the wrong reasons. In episode 6 of a cartoon aimed at children. The Campfire Song is the opposite. It's a piece of pure escalation, where SpongeBob explains a song and then performs it faster and faster, while Squidward becomes progressively more furious, and the joke is entirely rhythmic. There is no content, there is just tempo. Goofy Goober Rock comes from the 2004 film. It's a cover of Twisted Sister's I Wanna Rock, performed during a sequence where SpongeBob plays a guitar solo that defeats a villain, in a film that had, until that point, been about a road trip. The film's whole argument is that being a kid isn't a weakness, and it makes that argument via hair metal, which shouldn't work and completely does. There's also the Krusty Krab Pizza song, which is 11 words long, and which a truly enormous number of people can sing on demand. And then Best Day Ever, which is the closing song of an episode about a day going comprehensively wrong. Tom Kenny wrote songs for the show himself at various points, which is another thing that gets forgotten about him. The consistent thread here is that the songs are never played ironically. When the show does a musical number, it commits fully, with real arrangements and real performances, and the comedy comes from the situation rather than from the music being deliberately bad. Which is exactly the technique that made the Band Geeks payoff land, and it's why that episode is the one people name. Let me say a bit more about library music, because I've been thinking about it since I started reading up on this, and I've genuinely changed my view of it. Production music libraries are one of the invisible institutions of 20th century media. Composers were paid to record enormous volumes of material to order, categorized by mood and function: tension, chase, romantic, comedy, pratfall, nautical, Hawaiian. It was recorded in bulk, often by very good session musicians, and then licensed cheaply to anyone who needed 60 seconds of anything. Most of it was made for industrial films, local television, newsreels, and adverts. Nobody expected any of it to be remembered. And then a handful of shows started using it heavily and with genuine affection, and now those recordings, made by musicians whose names most people will never know, are among the most recognisable pieces of music of the last 30 years to anyone under 40. There's something quite moving about that. Someone sat in a studio in the 1960s and recorded a jaunty piece of Hawaiian steel guitar for a catalogue, got paid a session fee, and went home. and that recording is now permanently associated with a yellow sponge in the minds of hundreds of millions of people. The specific sonic identity is worth naming, because the show has one, and most cartoons don't. There's the steel guitar, sliding, there's ukulele, there's the sound of a small dance band that sounds like it's playing in a hotel lobby in 1955. There are shanties arranged for concertina and accordion. There are enormous, ridiculous dramatic orchestral stings that come from a completely different library and are deployed over nothing. And crucially, all of it is period. None of it sounds like 1999 or 2010 or now. The show has never once used contemporary music in its score, which is why episodes don't date. A cartoon that scored itself with whatever was on the radio in 2003 would be unwatchable now. This one sounds exactly the same as it always did, because it was already old when it started. That's a decision that kept paying off long after anyone could have predicted it, and I doubt anyone made it for that reason. The transitions deserve one more mention. Those short lap steel stings that play over the time cards are 5 separate phrases, composed for the show, and they function as punctuation. They're not underscore, they're grammar. They tell you a scene has ended and time has passed, and they do it in about a second and a half. There is a version of the show where those don't exist and scenes just cut, and I promise you, it is a worse show. Sea shanties, finally, are worth a paragraph on their own, because the show's affection for them predates the fairly recent moment when the rest of the world briefly remembered they existed. A shanty is a work song. It exists to coordinate physical effort on a ship. The rhythm isn't decorative, it's functional, because a crew hauling on a rope needs to pull together. Call and response is the standard structure, with a shantyman leading and the crew answering, which is precisely the form of the show's theme song. So the opening of SpongeBob SquarePants is structurally a piece of maritime labour music, adapted so that a painting can shout at children. I'm not sure Hillenburg needed it to be that accurate. I'm quite glad it is. The sound design deserves a final note, separate from the music, because it's a genuinely large part of why the show feels the way it does. There are a lot of sounds in SpongeBob that exist nowhere else. The bubble transition, the specific squelch of SpongeBob walking, the foghorn alarm clock, the slide whistle, deployed constantly and shamelessly. The seagulls in the opening, which are surface birds, over the ocean, in a show set at the bottom of it. The bubbles are the important one. Underwater atmosphere runs almost continuously in the background at a low level, and it's the sonic equivalent of the blue in the frame. It's always there, and you never register it, and it's what gives even the loudest episode a soft floor. That constant low background is also, incidentally, a large part of why this show is so easy to sleep through. There's very little true silence in it, which means there are very few sudden contrasts, which means far fewer of those moments where the audio drops out and your brain snaps back to the room. Whether anyone designed it that way, I sincerely doubt. It's a byproduct of setting a cartoon underwater and then being thorough about it. And there are a few more original songs I ought to name before I leave the subject. The FUN song, which is SpongeBob teaching Plankton the meaning of friendship via an acronym, and which contains one of the show's better jokes when Plankton's version of the same acronym turns out to be about destroying everything. The Sweet Victory sequence we've discussed. Gary Come Home, which is a genuinely sad song about a lost snail, and which people are on record as having cried at. The Goofy Goober theme in its various forms. What all of these have in common is that they're properly produced. Real arrangements, real vocals, real mixing. Nobody phoned in a cartoon song. Which is why they've had lives outside the show, appearing on streaming services and charting occasionally, decades after the episodes they came from. A cartoon about a sponge has a back catalogue. That's a strange sentence, and it's completely true. There is an official SpongeBob Lost episode, and it isn't lost, and it never was. The Sponge Who Could Fly, aired on the 21st of March 2003 in the third season. Its official subtitle is the SpongeBob SquarePants Lost Episode, and the entire framing device is Patchy the Pirate in live action, promising the audience a lost episode and then losing it. The bit runs like this. Potty the parrot flies into Patchy's bathroom to tell him that an audience of children is waiting. Patchy is in the shower. He announces that he's lost the lost episode and tells the children to forget about it. It escalates from there. At one point, Patchy believes the lost episode is nothing but a series of cheap walk cycles and has a full breakdown about it. He renounces the entire fandom on camera. He throws out all of his SpongeBob merchandise, every last piece, and leaves the house intending to run away. Then Potty tells him there's more on the tape, and the footage of him disposing of his collection simply plays in reverse while he puts it all back. The actual episode inside all of this is about SpongeBob wanting to fly with the jellyfish. He tries a plane, he tries a kite, none of it works, and then he accidentally inflates his own trousers with a hairdryer and takes off. He uses this to help people. The people of Bikini Bottom then demand more and more of his time until it stops being fun, which is a slightly bleaker morale than the framing device would suggest. There's a detail in the audio commentary that I adore. During the segment, Tom Kenny's character reacts so strongly that smoke comes out of his ears. Hillenburg confirmed on the commentary that this wasn't exaggerated in post. They did it practically. Smoke actually came out of the man's ears. Now the episodes that genuinely did get pulled, which is a different thing entirely. Midlife Crustacean is a third season episode from 2003. Mr. Krabs is having a midlife crisis and asks SpongeBob and Patrick to take him out for a night he'll remember. What they take him on is a panty raid, which is a real American college prank from roughly the 1940s to the 1960s, involving breaking into women's dormitories and stealing underwear. The punchline is that the house they break into belongs to Mr. Krabs' mother, who catches them and sends her adult son to his childhood bedroom. Nickelodeon took it out of rotation in 2018 following a standards review in which they determined some story elements were not kid-appropriate, which in fairness is not a controversial conclusion. The issue wasn't a single joke that aged badly. The whole episode is built on it. The other one is Quarantined Crab, and this is the more interesting case because the episode did nothing wrong at all. It's a 12th season episode in which a health inspector locks down the Krusty Krab because of an outbreak of something called the clam flu. Everyone is quarantined inside. It's played entirely for laughs, in the way that a cartoon does. It was written roughly 2 years before the COVID-19 pandemic. Nickelodeon pulled it, citing sensitivities around a global real-world pandemic, which is about as reasonable a call as a network can make. It aired in France in May 2020, before the decision, and then sat unavailable in the United States until 2022. Both episodes have since found their way back into streaming rotation. The one that was quietly pulled for content and the one that was pulled for accidental timing both came back, which I think is the right outcome. Locking things away permanently tends to just make them more interesting. Right. Time travel. SB-129 is a first season episode, and it's one of the strangest things the show has ever done. Squidward, trying to escape SpongeBob, and Patrick hides in a freezer and is frozen for 2,000 years. He wakes up in a chrome future populated by Spongetron, a robotic descendant of SpongeBob. Spongetron has 486 clones. Each one is named after a letter of the alphabet. Given that the English alphabet contains 26 letters, this raises questions about the naming convention that the episode does not answer and which I have thought about more than is reasonable. Squidward then travels back instead and arrives in the prehistoric past where he encounters primitive versions of everyone and inadvertently invents jellyfishing, art and the clarinet, all of which he then abandons in disgust. He also spends a period trapped in pure white void, which the episode calls nowhere, and which is genuinely unnerving for a cartoon aimed at 7-year-olds. The prehistoric idea came back properly in a half-hour special done in the style of a nature documentary with SpongeGar, Patar and Squog. They're more advanced than the SB-129 versions, using stone tools and fire. There's also a primitive Gary, who is enormous, and a primitive Krabs, who is tiny, and whose entire vocabulary is the word money repeated. That's a very efficient piece of character writing. The joke is that greed predates language. Dunces and Dragons takes the same trick in the other direction and drops them into a medieval Bikini Bottom, complete with ancestors for everyone, which is where the King Krabs version of the recipe comes from. And then there's Doodle Bob. In Frankendoodle, a magic pencil falls from the surface and lands in Bikini Bottom. SpongeBob draws a rough version of himself with it, and the drawing comes alive. Doodle Bob is a scribbled, badly proportioned, aggressive thing that speaks in gibberish and attacks people. He's genuinely one of the more disturbing character designs in the show, mostly because he looks like something a child drew, which is exactly what he is. The episode ends with him flattened into a piece of paper, still moving, which is not a comforting resolution. The last one worth mentioning here is the Flying Dutchman, who is the show's one properly recurring supernatural figure. He's a ghost pirate. He's green, he collects souls, and he turns up periodically with no explanation of how any of it works in a town otherwise governed by ordinary physics. He becomes considerably more important later on, and we'll get there. But before that, let's talk about the theories, because there are a lot of them, and one turned out to be more or less correct. While we're in the odd corners, there are a handful of episodes that come up constantly whenever people talk about this show, and I'd like to go through them properly, because they're the reason the second and third seasons have the reputation they do. Graveyard Shift is the one people bring up first. The Krusty Krab goes 24 hours. SpongeBob and Squidward are left alone overnight, and Squidward invents a story about a killer to frighten him. The killer is the hash-slinging slasher, and the joke is largely that SpongeBob cannot say the name correctly. What makes the episode work is the structure. Squidward makes it up, and then every element of the invented story starts happening, one by one, exactly as described. The bus, the lights, the phone, and the escalation is played completely straight, with real tension, until the reveal, which is an anti-climax delivered by a character who then wanders off. It's a horror episode, genuinely. In a cartoon about a hamburger restaurant, chocolate with nuts is the one I'd defend as the funniest. SpongeBob and Patrick decide to become door-to-door chocolate salesmen and go from house to house, being comprehensively defeated by every single person they meet. There's a man who screams the word chocolate. There's an elderly pair who con them repeatedly. There's an increasingly unhinged sales technique. It's essentially a sales comedy, and the observational accuracy of it is uncomfortably high. Idiot Box is the one that's actually about something. Patrick and SpongeBob buy an enormous television, throw the television away, and play inside the cardboard box using nothing but imagination. Squidward, hearing extremely convincing sound effects coming from inside a box, becomes obsessed with working out how they're doing it. He gets in the box, nothing happens. He can't do it because he's forgotten how, and the show doesn't explain that or spell it out. It just lets him sit in a cardboard box in silence. Nasty Patty is the one where a health inspector appears to die, and the episode becomes, for about 8 minutes, a fairly faithful crime story about two people disposing of a body. It gets away with it because the tone never wobbles. Krusty Krab training video is a formal experiment. The entire episode is presented as a corporate training tape, complete with narration, chapter headings and diagrams, and it satirises workplace induction material so precisely that people who have sat through those tapes find it slightly upsetting. Dying for Pie is the one with genuine emotional weight. Squidward believes he has accidentally given SpongeBob a pie that will kill him, and spends the day giving him the best possible time out of guilt. The ending is a joke, obviously, but the middle of it is Squidward being kind for an entire episode, which the show rations very carefully, and which is why it lands when it happens. And then there's the Alaskan bullworm, which is a very large worm, and Bubble Buddy, in which SpongeBob makes a friend out of a bubble, and the entire town is forced to accommodate a bubble, and Wormy, which is about a caterpillar becoming a butterfly and being mistaken for a monster. Wormy is worth a note, actually. The joke is that a completely ordinary act of metamorphosis is perceived as a horror, and the biology in it is entirely accurate. A larva pupates and emerges as something different. That's a real thing that happens constantly, and it is, if you think about it for more than 4 seconds, genuinely one of the strangest processes on this planet. A caterpillar does not grow wings. It largely dissolves and rebuilds. Butterflies have been shown in some studies to retain learned associations from their larval stage, which means something in there survives the process, which is a fact I have never fully recovered from. The show does not mention any of this. It just has everyone run away from a butterfly. Something I should say about the wider conversation around the series, because it comes up constantly, and I don't want to pretend it doesn't. There's a long-running argument in the fandom about the show's decline after the 2004 film. It has its own vocabulary, its own list of offending episodes, and its own dedicated wiki, and it can get fairly heated for a discussion about a cartoon. My honest view is that it's more complicated than the standard telling. The seasons immediately after the film are genuinely weaker, and the reasons are structural rather than anyone doing a bad job. The person who created it stepped back. The show was asked to produce enormous volumes of episodes. The original writing team dispersed. That combination will damage anything. But the show also recovered. The later seasons, particularly from around the mid-2010s onward, are considerably better than their reputation, partly because Hillenburg came back, and partly because a new group of people found their feet. There are episodes from the last decade that would sit perfectly well in Season 3. The reputation lags the reality by about 8 years, which is normal for anything with a devoted early audience. And the thing that gets lost in the argument entirely is the scale of the achievement. 330-odd episodes is an absurd number. Almost nothing survives that. The question of whether episode 200 is as good as episode 40 is frankly an unfair question to ask of any show that has been running since before most of its current audience was born. One last thing from this section, because I skipped it and it's a good one. There's an episode called The Secret Box, in which Patrick has a box. He will not let SpongeBob look inside. That's the whole plot. A man has a box and a friend wants to see in it, and the friend is refused. The escalation is entirely psychological. SpongeBob becomes increasingly desperate, attempts a series of schemes, and eventually gets the box open, and what's inside is deliberately anticlimactic in a way I won't spoil in case you go and watch it. I mention it because it's the show at its most confident. There is no threat, no villain, no jeopardy, and no lesson. It is 11 minutes about curiosity, and it works completely, and there is no other children's program from that era that would have risked it. That's the thing I'd point to if somebody asked me why the good seasons are good. Not the jokes, though the jokes are excellent. The willingness to build an entire episode out of something almost nothing, and to trust that watching these particular characters deal with almost nothing is enough. It usually was. Since we're in the outer reaches of the thing, a word about the spin-offs, because they're more interesting than a single line suggests. Camp Coral is a prequel. It shows the characters as children at a summer camp, with Mr. Krabs running the place as a single father with a baby Pearl. It's computer animated rather than drawn, which was a genuinely divisive choice, and it was one of the launch titles for the streaming service. The awkwardness of it is that Hillenburg was, by most accounts, opposed to spin-offs on principle. He was protective of the world and had resisted expanding it into other formats for a long time. The prequel was greenlit shortly before his death and produced afterwards, and there was a fair amount of unhappiness about that at the time, some of it from people who had worked with him. I'm not going to arbitrate that. It's a real disagreement with real people, on both sides, and both positions are reasonable. A creator's stated preferences matter. So does the fact that a large number of artists rely on the work continuing. The Patrick Star Show is the odder of the two, and, I'd argue, the better one. It's a variety show format. Patrick hosts a talk show from his family home, with commercials, sketches, recurring segments, a stop-motion strand, and a science fiction strand animated in a completely different style. It's genuinely strange television. The writers have said openly that they wanted to bend the format further than the main series could, and they have. It's much closer in spirit to the weird corners of the original show than the prequel is, which is a slightly ironic outcome. Then the two streaming films built around individual characters, Saving Bikini Bottom, which centres on Sandy and involves the town being stolen and taken to Texas, and Plankton, the movie, which finally hands the villain a feature. There's a music-driven Squidward film that has been announced without a date, which is either going to be extraordinary or a catastrophe, and I would watch either. Let's start with a small one the show actually answered, because it's a nice illustration of how this usually goes. For years people theorised about what the patties were made of, and the theories got fairly grim, in the way that internet theories about children's cartoons reliably do. And then Hillenburg simply said they were vegan, and the entire structure collapsed. No mystery, no allegory, plants. Most of the big theories don't get that treatment though, they just persist. The biggest one, by a distance, is the 7 deadly sins. The idea is that each main character represents one of the sins from Christian teaching. SpongeBob is lust, Patrick is sloth, Squidward is wrath, Sandy is pride, Mr. Krabs is greed, Plankton is envy, Gary is gluttony. It's been shared millions of times. It's the sort of thing that turns up in comment sections underneath completely unrelated videos. And it's got a real elegance to it, which is exactly why it's lasted. The cast were asked about it directly, in that Esquire reunion. Roger Bumpass's response was, I think, the honest one. He said he could see it for Patrick and for Mr. Krabs, and not really for anybody else, which is fair because those two are the ones where the fit is genuinely tight. Patrick lives under a rock and once won an award for doing nothing longer than anyone else. Krabs' entire personality is money. Those work, the rest are a stretch. SpongeBob, as lust requires you to redefine lust as enthusiasm, Sandy as pride requires you to read a character who is confident and competent as sinfully arrogant, which says more about the person doing the reading. Gary as gluttony is based on a snail eating. Mr. Lawrence, who as we've established is a writer as well as a performer, gave the more useful answer, which is that the characters have distinct traits, but nothing as tidy as one sin apiece. Hillenburg never confirmed it. There's no evidence he intended any religious framework at all, and everything we know about how the cast was assembled points the other way. These are tide-pool animals with jobs. Why does it survive anyway? Because any 7 distinct characters will map onto 7 broad archetypes if you push hard enough. Greed, laziness, anger, vanity, appetite, envy, and desire aren't obscure categories. They're most of the ways a person can be annoying. Write 7 characters who are each annoying in a different way, and you will land on that list by accident. I don't say that dismissively. Pattern finding is a lovely thing to do with a show you like. It's just worth knowing which patterns were put there and which ones you brought with you. Which is a decent moment to note the exception. The atomic testing connection, which we went through earlier, is the rare case where the fan reading was substantially right, and somebody involved confirmed it out loud. 1 out of dozens. That ratio is about what you'd expect. The other theory families I'll deal with briefly, because there's not much in them. There's a reading where each character represents a mental health condition. There's another where each one is on a different drug. Both of these are adult projection dressed up as analysis, and neither has anything behind it beyond the fact that cartoon characters have exaggerated personalities, which is what cartoon characters are for, I'd leave them alone. There is one genuine unresolved thing though, and the show does it on purpose. Mrs. Puff has a past. We never learn her first name, not once. She's Mrs. Puff for the entire run. There's a Mr. Puff who is dead, and whose fate is one of the darker jokes in the series, and one I'm not going to spell out at this hour. She has been to prison repeatedly, largely as a consequence of SpongeBob's driving, and she moves through that experience with a familiarity that suggests it wasn't her first time. There are references to a history she doesn't discuss. The show gestures at it and then walks away every time. And unlike the recipe, which has 3 answers, this one has none. That's a deliberate gap rather than a contradiction, and it's the only real mystery in the character roster. Then there are the ordinary continuity holes, which I'd like to defend rather than catalogue. SpongeBob's age has never been established in a way that survives contact with any other episode. He has a driving school career measured in years and no license. Gary is a mollusk who makes a cat noise. Squidward has 6 limbs. Pearl is a whale with a crab for a father. The Krusty Krab is at least 3 different things depending on which flashback you're watching. The correct response to all of this is not to build a chronology. It's to notice that the show has never once claimed to have one. That's a real position, held deliberately. Continuity is a tool for shows where consequences matter. SpongeBob is built on the opposite principle, where everything resets and nothing accumulates, which is precisely why you can put on any episode from any season in any order, and it works. The lack of a timeline is a feature of the format, not damage to it. It's also, not coincidentally, the reason nothing is ever owed to you as a viewer. Which brings us finally to what happened to the man who made all of it, and to the strange second life the whole thing has had since. There's one more reading of the show that I think has genuinely more to it than the sins. And it doesn't get discussed anywhere near as often. It's the idea that the characters function as stock types, in the way that theatrical traditions have always used stock types. Commedia dell'arte is the usual comparison. That's the Italian tradition where you have a fixed set of masked characters, each with a defined temperament and a defined relationship to the others, and you generate an infinite number of stories by putting them in situations. The miser, the pedant, the innocent, the servant, the braggart, and SpongeBob maps onto that far more cleanly than it maps onto anything theological. Krabs is the miser, precisely and completely. Squidward is the pretentious one who considers himself above the company he keeps. Patrick is the fool. Plankton is the scheming inferior. SpongeBob is the innocent whose sincerity disrupts everyone. That framework does real work because it explains the format. Stock character comedy doesn't need continuity. It needs a stable set of temperaments and a new situation each week. And the comedy comes from watching known quantities collide in a new configuration, which is exactly what this show is and exactly why it can run indefinitely. It also explains why the characters don't develop. People sometimes complain about that, but Squidward learning a lesson and becoming content would end the engine, in the same way that Plankton winning would. The stasis isn't laziness, it's the form. I don't know whether anyone on the crew thought about it in those terms. I suspect not, and I suspect they arrived at it because it's what works, and people have been arriving at it for 400 years. A word about Squidward specifically, since the internet has decided he's the tragic one. There's a whole genre of commentary arguing that Squidward is the most realistic character in the show, that he's a portrait of thwarted ambition, and that the reason adults gravitate towards him is that he is doing a job he doesn't like, next to people he finds exhausting, believing himself capable of more. That's basically right, and I don't think it needs to be turned into anything darker than that. He's a recognisable person. The show is fond of him. It gives him real victories occasionally, and it gives him a genuinely good day now and then, and it lets him be right about things. The mistake people make is reading the character as a warning. He isn't. He's a joke about a specific and extremely common way of being unhappy, told with enough affection that it doesn't sting, and it's worth saying plainly that the show never punishes him for having taste. His clarinet playing is bad, but his desire to play the clarinet is treated as entirely legitimate. His paintings are unremarkable, but painting is not mocked. The joke is the gap between the ambition and the ability, which is a gap most people are standing in about something. There's a related question I get asked whenever this show comes up, which is why it works so well as background. I think it's a combination of three things, and none of them are mysterious. The first is the reset. We've covered that. Nothing carries over, so nothing is required of you. The second is the sound design, which we went through earlier, and which does considerably more work than anyone gives it credit for. The third is familiarity, which does the heavy lifting. A show you already know demands nothing from the part of your brain that tracks new information, and that's the part that keeps you awake. You're not predicting, you're recognizing. That's not a claim about the show being special. It's the same reason people fall asleep to programs they've seen 40 times. It just happens that this one has 330 episodes of it, which is a large amount of runway. Right, a few remaining gaps and inconsistencies offered without any attempt to reconcile them. The show has depicted fire underwater on many occasions, including campfires and stovetops, and once explained it with a shrug. Characters drink water while submerged in water. There is a boating school in which the vehicles are boats, but the behaviour is entirely that of cars, including traffic lights, and nobody has ever asked how a boat obeys a traffic light. Sandy is the only one who would notice any of this, and she has never once mentioned it. SpongeBob's family are round natural sponges. His parents look nothing like him, which the show has addressed exactly 0 times. His grandmother bakes. Squidward's ancestors and descendants have appeared. Mr. Krabs' mother is alive and formidable. Patrick's family situation has been rewritten more than once, and the spin-off series went ahead and gave him a completely new household, which is either a retcon or a parallel version depending on how generous you're feeling. So the family tree doesn't survive contact with itself. I'd leave it there. If you came here looking for a unified theory, I'm afraid the honest answer is that there isn't one, and that the absence is the point. A final few loose ends, offered as loose ends. Nobody knows how old any of these characters are, and the show has actively made this worse rather than better. SpongeBob has been described in various places as being an adult, in various others as young, and the spin-off series shows him as a child at summer camp with the entire cast, including his boss, which does not fit any timeline you could construct. There's a widely circulated birth date for him in July 1986, which comes from secondary material rather than from anything stated on screen with any weight. I mention it because you'll see it everywhere, and it's worth knowing it sits on thinner ground than it looks. The boating school situation is my favourite unresolved thing, because it's the one the show has actively refused to fix. He has been enrolled for the entire run. He has taken the test an enormous number of times. He has passed it in a small number of episodes, and it has always been undone by the next one. That's not carelessness. Somebody has repeatedly made the decision to take the license away again, because the day he passes is the day Mrs. Puff has no reason to appear. And the last thing I'll flag is a category of theory I have deliberately not gone near tonight, which is the creepypasta material. There's a whole ecosystem of invented lost episodes and fake horror stories attached to this show, written by people online in the late 2000s, none of which is real, none of which has ever been connected to anything the production made, and most of which is unpleasant for no particular purpose. I've left it out because it isn't lore, it's fan fiction wearing a costume, and it has nothing to do with the actual history of the thing, which is considerably more interesting and involves a man in Dana Point with a photocopier. If you go looking, you'll find it. I'd suggest not at this hour. Actually, one more, because I said I'd defend the gaps rather than list them, and I want to make the defence properly. There's a habit people have with long-running fiction of treating inconsistency as a failure of care, and sometimes it is. But there's a difference between a show that is trying to maintain a coherent world and failing, and a show that has never been trying. This one has never been trying. It is stated openly by the people who make it. Every episode returns everything to where it started, because the format demands it, and because the alternative is a show where you have to have watched the previous 400 installments to understand why the crab is upset. What that buys you is enormous. It buys you the ability to be silly without consequence. It buys you an episode about a box. It buys you a version of the character who is a caveman, and a version who is a knight, and a version who is a robot's ancestor, all in the same catalogue without anyone having to explain themselves. And it buys the viewer something too, which is a show that expects nothing and withholds nothing. Very little television made now will let you look away like that. The 2004 film was supposed to be the ending. That's not a fan reading, it's the stated intent. The SpongeBob SquarePants movie was written and directed by Hillenburg as a finale. And if you watch it with that in mind, it reads completely differently, because it plays like a farewell. SpongeBob has to prove he's not a kid. The whole thing is about growing up and taking the job. It ends on a note of resolution that a series does not normally get to have. Nickelodeon, understandably, was not going to stop making it. The show was enormous. So the film came out, it did well, and the series carried on. Hillenburg stepped down as showrunner. He stayed on as an executive producer, and the day-to-day went to Paul Tibbett, who'd been part of the crew for years. Hillenburg went off and made short films instead, including one called Hollywood BLVD, USA in 2013. Then around 2015, he came back. He co-wrote the story for Sponge Out of Water and took an executive producer credit on it, and he started attending meetings on the series again. Increased his involvement generally. He was, by all accounts, back in the room. In March 2017, he told reporters he had been diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. He said he intended to keep working on the show for as long as he was able, and asked for privacy, and that was more or less the last public statement. He died at home on the 26th of November, 2018. He was 57. The cause was cardiopulmonary failure resulting from the disease. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean off the California coast the following day. I don't have anything clever to add to that. A man who spent his 20s teaching children about the sea, and the rest of his life making the most successful piece of ocean-related entertainment that has ever existed, was returned to the ocean. It's the correct ending, and nobody had to arrange it. What happened at the Super Bowl a couple of months later is a slightly strange coda. A fan started a petition asking for Sweet Victory to be performed at the halftime show of Super Bowl in February 2019 as a tribute. It picked up tens of thousands of signatures very quickly, largely because the original scene takes place at the Bubble Bowl, which is a Super Bowl parody, so there was a neatness to it that people responded to. Maroon 5 were performing. They arranged to use a clip from the episode during their set. What actually happened was that the clip was very brief, a few seconds of animation. The full song, with a dedication to Hillenburg, was played inside Mercedes-Benz Stadium, but not during the broadcast, so the vast majority of people watching didn't get it. This went down badly. Extremely badly, in fact, and a short while later, the Dallas Stars played the full thing at one of their games, in front of a crowd that reacted the way everyone had wanted the first crowd to react, which is a satisfying resolution to an unsatisfying moment. Now, the Broadway musical, which I have to talk about because it's genuinely one of the odder success stories in modern theatre. It started with a tryout in Chicago in 2016. Previews opened at the Palace Theatre in New York in November 2017, and the show officially opened on the 4th of December. Everyone expected a theme park attraction with a ticket price, What they got was something else entirely. The design didn't attempt to recreate the cartoon. There were no character suits, no giant foam heads. Ethan Slater played SpongeBob as a person, in shorts and long socks, and the whole thing ran on a sort of gleeful theatrical nonsense that critics were completely unprepared for. The reviews were among the warmest of the season. The score is the part that makes people's eyebrows go up. The songs were written by a genuinely absurd assortment of musicians, each contributing one number. Cyndi Lauper, Sarah Bareilles, John Legend, Steven Tyler and Joe Perry of Aerosmith, Yolanda Adams, The Flaming Lips, They Might Be Giants, Panic, At the Disco, Plain White T's, T.I., Jonathan Colton, Lady Antebellum, and David Bowie, who wrote a song for it before he died. At the Tony Awards in 2018, it received 12 nominations, tying with Mean Girls for the most of the season. It won 1 for David Zinn's scenic design. The band's visit took most of the major categories that year, and there were a lot of people who felt SpongeBob had been slightly hard done by. It closed in September 2018 for a mixture of reasons, including a scheduled renovation of the theatre, and it's since had a life in schools and youth theatre, which feels correct. Alongside all this, the show was having a completely separate second life that nobody planned at all. The memes. Surprised Patrick, which is a still from the 2004 film, It Him a Head Out, which is a frame of SpongeBob half standing in a chair, Handsome Squidward, from the episode The Two Faces of Squidward, which is a chiseled and unsettlingly attractive version of him used to represent any dramatic improvement. Mocking SpongeBob, with the alternating capital letters, Caveman SpongeBob, from the prehistoric material we went through earlier. What's remarkable about that list is how many of them come from throwaway single frames. Not jokes, not scenes. Individual drawings that were on screen for a fraction of a second and then got pulled out and given an entirely separate career. The show is unusually good at this because of how expressive the animation is, and because there are simply so many episodes that the supply of odd faces is effectively infinite. Where things stand now, as of this year, the series has passed 330 episodes. Season 17 premiered in June 2026. It is still in production, 27 years after the preview aired. There have been 2 spin-off series, Camp Coral, which is a prequel about the characters at a summer camp as children, and The Patrick Star Show, in which Patrick hosts a chaotic variety show from his family home, and which is considerably weirder than the parent series. There have been 2 Netflix films built around individual characters, Saving Bikini Bottom, which is Sandy's, in 2024, and Plankton, the movie, in 2025. And then, in December 2025, there was a 4th theatrical film, the SpongeBob movie, Search for SquarePants. It's directed by Derek Dryman, the man in the second Hawaiian shirt. 28 years after he walked into that pitch meeting with a boombox, he's directing the theatrical feature. The plot has SpongeBob, who has just become tall enough to ride a roller coaster, and is very pleased about it, trying to prove he's brave by following the Flying Dutchman into the deepest part of the sea. Mark Hamill voices the Dutchman. It made around $168 million against a budget of $64 million, and it got the best critical reception of any film in the franchise, which nobody was expecting from the 4th one. There's a small detail in it that I'll mention, and then leave alone. In a high school locker room scene, one of the lockers has a name on it. Stephen H. Let me put some proper scale on what this thing became, because the numbers are genuinely difficult to hold in your head. The series is the highest rated show the network has ever had. It's the most widely distributed property the company owns, which means it has been dubbed and broadcast in an enormous number of territories, and it is the thing that keeps a channel going. There are entire international broadcasters whose children's schedules would collapse without it. The merchandising side generated something in the region of $13 billion according to figures reported around the end of the last decade. That's not the show's revenue. That's the toys, the clothing, the bedding, the lunch boxes, the trainers, the stationery, the branded macaroni. I include that only because it makes the origin story funnier. A photocopied comic about tide pools that nobody would publish is now, at one remove, a 13-figure retail category. There are theme park attractions on multiple continents. There's a roller coaster named after the Trench episode. There are 4D cinema experiences. There have been branded restaurants. There's a hotel suite built to look like the Pineapple, which exists and which people can and do sleep in. The show has been recognised by essentially every institution that recognises things. Multiple Emmy wins, a great many Annie Awards, and Hillenburg personally received an award from Heal the Bay for raising awareness of marine life, which is the one I suspect he'd have been most pleased about. The character has turned up in places that make very little sense. He has been named among the great cartoon characters of the era by more than one publication. He has been cited as a favourite by heads of state. He has appeared on the side of aircraft. And in December 2025, alongside the fourth film, Paramount and Nickelodeon announced an ocean conservation and sustainability initiative built around the character, which is, when you line it up against the biography, a fairly perfect circle. A marine educator invents a character to teach children about the sea. 26 years later, the character is used to raise money and awareness for the sea. That's not a coincidence anyone engineered. It's just a thing returning to what it was for. I do want to circle back to something about the 2004 film, because knowing it was meant to be, the end changes it. The plot is that Mr. Krabs is framed, King Neptune's crown is stolen, and SpongeBob and Patrick have to travel to Shell City to retrieve it. SpongeBob has just been passed over for a promotion on the grounds that he's a kid. That's the wound the film runs on. And the resolution is not that he grows up. The resolution is that he goes and does something enormously difficult while remaining exactly who he is, and then says so, out loud, in a musical number. The film's actual argument is that there is nothing wrong with him. As a series finale, that's the correct final statement. The show's entire thesis, delivered plainly, and then a door closing. Except the door didn't close. And there's a version of this where that's a tragedy. The artist overruled and the work continued past its ending against his wishes. I don't think that's what happened, though. And the reason I don't is that he came back. He didn't have to. He'd made his money and made his short films and had every reason to stay away. He came back in 2015, started attending meetings, took a producer credit, and kept working after the diagnosis for as long as he could, which suggests a person who had made peace with the thing being bigger than his plan for it. There's a last piece of the legacy that got to me a bit, and it's about the crew rather than the man. The people making the show now include a substantial number who grew up watching it, storyboard artists who were 7 when it premiered, writers whose first exposure to the format was this exact series. That's a full generational handover happening inside a single production, and it's why the show still sounds like itself. You can see it in the small things, the willingness to spend a minute on a wordless gag, the specific rhythm of a Squidward reaction, the fact that when a new episode does something odd, it's odd in the show's particular way, rather than in a generic modern cartoon way. That's not something you can put in a Bible and hand to people. It's transmitted by having watched it, which is exactly how the thing got made in the first place. By a man who'd been carrying a photocopied comic around for 10 years. A last few observations about where the show sits now, and then I'll wind this up. The thing I find most unusual about SpongeBob's longevity is that it never had a reinvention. There's no gritty era, no continuity reboot, no season where they aged everyone up, no attempt to chase whatever was fashionable. The format that was established in 1999 is the format being used this year. Compare that to almost anything else that has run for that long. Most long-running properties survive by mutating. This one survived by refusing to. The animation has changed, obviously. It's cleaner now, the colour is different, the digital tools have moved on considerably. The pacing is faster than it was, which is partly the crew and partly the era. But the shape of an episode, the two 11-minute segments, the title card, the bubble transition, the steel guitar, is identical. There is something almost stubborn about that, and I think it's why the whole catalogue is so usable. An episode from 2002 and an episode from 2026 sit next to each other, without a seam. You could shuffle 300 of them and play them at random, which is precisely what a lot of people do. The other thing worth noting is the audience situation, which is genuinely peculiar. The show has, at this point, 3 distinct audiences watching it simultaneously. There are the children it's made for, who are watching it now for the first time. There are the adults who watched it as children and have come back to it, often for exactly the reason you're listening to this. And there is a large group of people who have never really watched it and know it entirely, through fragments, through memes and quotes and reaction images, without ever having seen a full episode. That third group is a genuinely new phenomenon, and I don't think anyone quite knows what to do with it. There are people who can quote a dozen lines from this show and could not tell you what happens in a single episode. I find that a bit sad and a bit funny in roughly equal measure. And then the last thing, which is the succession question, and I'll be honest that I don't know the answer. The show has now outlived its creator by longer than it existed with him fully in charge, if you count from when he stepped back. It has been made by other people, in his style, with his blessing in some periods, and without his involvement in others, for the majority of its run. That's a strange thing to sit with. It's not unusual for a property to continue past its creator, but it is unusual for the continuation to be this faithful for this long, and it's unusual for the original person to have come back and worked on it again in the middle. What I'd say is that the show he made and the show that exists now are recognisably the same object, and I don't think that's an accident or luck. It's a group of people who care about it, quite a lot of whom learned what television was by watching it, which is about as good an outcome as anyone could reasonably ask for. Right, I've been talking for quite a long time, so I'll wrap up. When I started reading about all this, I expected a nice origin story and not much else. What I actually got was a mop lawsuit, a courtroom argument about a lobster trap, a marching band, and a man's ashes going into the Pacific. That's a considerably better afternoon than I'd planned on. A fair few things got left on the table. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy in full, because the parody runs much deeper than 2 old men in a nursing home. The Rocco's Modern Life crossover, which touches nearly every department. The video games, some of which are properly good. Patchy the Pirate's live-action universe, which has its own cast and its own continuity and makes almost no sense. The 2020 film, which I skipped over almost entirely. I'll get round to those, not tonight, obviously. If you're still awake, well